I'm going to be keeping you company for the next few hours.
You are not going to believe the company.
This company.
You're going to bankrupt your mama's company?
At least I have the radio to keep me company.
On 93.5 and 107.5, The Fan.
It's a massive weekend in college hoops. Great night to be a Boiler last night. And he talked about Purdue and the immediate reaction that occurs whenever they stumble, which is just 3 times this year, put to bed rather quickly in a dominant 96-68 win over Rutgers at Mackey last night. We'll get into that a little bit today as the show rolls on. Isaac Trotter going to join us at 1 o'clock. Nick Baumgardner going to join us at 2. And then we'll get heavily into the Pacers, not only this first segment, but also bottom of the 2 o'clock hour when Caitlin Cooper joins us. Does a great job covering the Pacers throughout the course of the NBA season. This is, of course, Jimmy Cook, Eddie Garrison behind the ones and twos. Your regular first voice you hear on this program, Jake Query, in case you have not listened to the show this week, is on a little PTO enjoying Las Vegas, Nevada. And instead, we have a little bit of a reunion on this 12 to 3 show. You know him as the beat writer for the Colts, as well as the, I won't label necessarily beat writer, but the man of many hats over at The Athletic because he's covered the Pacers as well. James Boyd in studio with us. James, how are you?
I'm doing good. Obviously a little jealous of Jake.
Yeah, he's going to see you too.
I know. I thought I was going to see Usher, honestly. But should be a good time. He deserved time off. And obviously there's a lot to talk about here in Indiana sports. So I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're going to use James, as you would expect whenever we have James Boyd in, heavily, especially on the Colts section, which we will get into. Have a little unique segment that Eddie's cooked up a little bit later in the show looking at off-season goals for the Colts. And with the combine right around the corner, we'll, of course, get James' perspective leading into all of that. Into what is the first real step of the offseason outside of tags and should you or should you not with Michael Pittman Jr. We'll get into all that today, but we start first with the Indiana Pacers, their opening matchup in however you want to fractionally divide the season. I'm used to just calling it the second half of the season because it's the All-Star break, but as Jake informed me, it's really more of a third and a comfortable win for the Pacers, I'll say, yesterday, 129-115, though Detroit made little runs to make the game interesting, James, but it never really felt like it was in danger.
No, I mean, Detroit's the worst team in the league, so you should beat them pretty handedly. I thought the first half they were dominant, obviously. Tyrese Halliburton looked really good, but there are certain instances with this team where I wonder if they're playing up or down to their competition in certain stretches. And that to me is a little bit of, I don't know if it's youth, inexperience, whatever it is, but I'm like, man, some of these games, they make it harder than it needs to be. Now, the win still counts all the same, but as far as goals for this team, playoffs, winning around, possibly all those things, you have to be able to hit somebody with a sledgehammer and kind of keep them down. And I don't feel like they've done that since acquiring Pascal Siakam. Obviously, chemistry might be a part of that as well, but I guess a win is a win is a win is a win.
For me, to kind of go off of that point, James, and I know exactly what you're talking about in regards to never really throttling an opponent. At the same time, it's the NBA. This happens. I was joking with Tony East yesterday that no lead ever feels safe in the NBA, whereas in the college ranks, you know, you're up by double digits. For the most part, if there's 8 minutes to go in the second half, you feel pretty good about that lead. In the NBA, it could be a 30-point lead in the third quarter, and that could go away in an instant. The most note for this Pacers team in that matchup against the Pistons, you know they're the worst team in the league. 8 wins on the year, and this ordinarily is my pet peeve. I can get away from it, James, because the Pacers won. Give up 45 in the third. Give up 45 and made Evan Fournier look like Ray Allen. Like, I'm not saying Evan Fournier is not a good shooter, but like anytime he got an open look, bang, bang, knocking him down. That was it. And I think that is in large part where you would like to see a step forward for this group, is not that they're going to suddenly become an elite defensive team, but continue to play high-level defense in spots. And, of course, they did throughout spurts of this game, especially to open it. 42-25 after one. They weren't letting Detroit get anything offensively in that first quarter, and I'm willing to chalk up some of it to the ebbs and flows of an NBA game, giving up 45 in the third. But all the same, there are little areas this team still needs to improve on. When you look at that aspect of it, is it defense? Is it maturity? Is it cohesion together with Pascal Siakam still a relatively new face and trying to adapt to life, everybody healed? Where is that for you?
I think part of it is like schematically, how do you make sure that you stick to whatever your game plan is? I'd imagine it's not giving up a ton of, open looks. And to your point, you just can't have the avalanche quarters. They're not gonna be an elite defensive team. They don't have the players to be that. I mean, if they did, they'd be that. Right. Quite honestly, like a lot of things come down to, do you have the dudes to do it? But I will add that you can't have a team like Detroit scoring 45 points in you in any quarter of a game and be a serious team. And I get it. Like you said, teams go on runs. They're still NBA players at the end of the day. But when I look at the Pacers now, and they're continuing to try to make the playoffs for the first time since 2020, the goal isn't just to get there. And that was what the entire philosophy got shifted or changed because of when Tyrese Halliburton got here. You went from being a team that, was referred to as a tough out. I remember Herb Simon saying, I love my little team, like the little brother of the Eastern Conference, to, no, we want to be able to contend in the Eastern Conference. And you contend by building good habits now. That way later on, they don't come back to bite you in games that you really need to win. And so I think part of it is frustrating because they've shown the ability to be engaged defensively, to, have hot hands, as I call them, and getting their hands on balls. And even Tyrese had a couple of, steals yesterday for back-to-back dunks. Those things I think can translate as long as you stay engaged with them. And so we'll see. Obviously, again, a win is a win is a win. You take it and you feel better, I guess, going, forward with it. But I just think of all the praise that Tyrese Halliburton got over the All-Star break, all the confidence that maybe other people around the league have in this Pacers team, and now you have to go out there and validate it. Because, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, Jimmy, even Eddie too, but this feels like the honeymoon stage for Tyrese Halliburton, right? He can do no wrong. We love him. He's here. He wants to be here in Indiana. But as soon as they make the playoffs, and however way it goes, if they win around, don't win around, the narrative will shift. Not maybe here in Indianapolis or Indiana because people love the team and they love Halliburton, but the national narrative as far as the praise. I talked to Shaq this weekend, and he was saying, or last weekend, he was saying, oh, he could be the face of the league in a few years, and this league should be his. And I'm like, he hasn't played in a playoff game yet.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are as far as that pressure to kind of validate everything we heard over the All-Star break.
I think that there is a built-in extended honeymoon here for him nationally this season, to your point, because they're going to be a playoff or play-in team. I think they're going to be a playoff team. I've said that since the beginning of the season. That was further validated and increased when they made the Pascal Siakam trade, because that is an all-star NBA champion with experience that, again, they didn't suddenly become an elite defensive team, but they added another weapon into the system where, just from a lineup standpoint, and it's the first time in the Siakam era, which I'm just using that as a frame of reference. I get it. Era is probably too strong a word there, but in his time here in Indiana, it's the first time I was able to see him up close and see him with Miles Turner. And that's just another, not just a body, but it's a menacing presence within this Pacers lineup to know that you have in any set two useful bigs, whether they're stretching the floor, whether they're inside the lane. Like you saw the first possession of the ball game last night. It's like, well, this is usually an area where it's a first basket opportunity for Miles Turner, get him in the pick and roll action, and instead they're using off-ball action to get Siakam free for a straightaway three, and he knocks it down. Like there's versatility within this lineup more so than there was prior to his arrival in Indiana, to the point that I feel pretty good about putting them as a 6 seed. So let's say that, for the sake of argument, on the Pacers side of things, we do that. We put them in the 6 seed confidently. There's no debate about it. Season ends today, and they are the 6. So they're up against Milwaukee. Then you get into the large-scale conversation of, is what they did to Milwaukee in the play-in a retainable result over the course of a 7-game series? And with how Milwaukee played to end the All-Star break, I would say yes. I think the Pacers, as it stands, despite the record, are a more connected group than Milwaukee is. Do I think that's going to keep that way the rest of the season? Absolutely not. Like, Damian Lillard's going to start to continue to come back and find his stride. They're going to be what they are, which is a contender in the East. But that said, the way you lose, I think, matters with where the perspective of this honeymoon period changes for Tyrese Halliburton nationally. Locally, I'm right there with you. This is a year away, likely, from being a real contender, a piece away, or a player growth leap like Bennett Mathurin away from being a legit contender next season. I think the way they play in the playoffs and or play-in dictates what happens nationally.
I think Milwaukee is their best matchup in terms of the playoffs, because when you look at Milwaukee and where they struggle to defend guards. They don't have Drew Holiday anymore, and Damian Lillard's not a defensive prowess-minded guard. He's more of an offensive guard, and if the Pacers are able to contain him like they did in the 5 games that they did this season where they went 4-1 against Milwaukee, there's a legit path to where the Pacers could win that first round against the Bucks simply because they can let Giannis do his thing. Brook Lopez has had a down season for Milwaukee. Bobby Portis has had a down season as well. And when you look at the guards, we talk about it with the NCAA tournament a lot. A lot of the times in the NBA, it's about having a dominant forward and a dominant guard. And right now, the Pacers have multiple avenues of guards that they can throw at Damian Lillard, the multitude amount of guards that can score. You've got Aaron Nesmith, who has developed really, really, really well, not even just as a shooter, but as a driver and as a decision maker. So I think when you look at and you start looking at like first round matchups, and I know we still have 25 games to do this, but 6th seed is probably the most ideal spot if you are Indiana, because then if you do defeat Milwaukee in the first round, you avoid playing Boston in the second round of the playoffs. And I think that's big because Boston is by far the worst matchup for the Indiana Pacers because of all the length and size that they have.
They're kind of everybody's worst matchup in a way, but yeah, especially the Pacers. Where do you see them as, to your same question? Whether it's, because at the end of the day, nationally, that matters to us, that matters to the fans. The players, they're obviously, as you know, as a beat writer, they're not worried about that.
Right.
But from your standpoint, where do things change with this team in the second half of the season, both from an expectation standpoint and what type of matchup they could draw in the postseason, which, as Eddie highlighted, still about 25 games away?
Yeah, I think you obviously need to stop treading water in a sense and start to like stack some wins, because since the Siakam trade, there has been sort of like this up and down nature of the team. I think they're 8-5 in the 13 games with him. And so you'd like to get them or see them go on a streak and get a rhythm and build some chemistry. But I will say, as far as the playoff seeding and stuff like that goes, obviously we're getting ahead of ourselves, but who doesn't in sports radio? But the thing I'll say is there is something to be said about the pressure of the playoffs. And that's the one thing that we can't really quantify or dictate or even like judge based off what happened earlier this season. And obviously it took Giannis scoring 64 points and then stealing the game ball afterwards, or having the game ball stolen from him to get their one win against this team. It took a franchise record scoring wise from him to get that one win against the Pacers. However, who do you trust more in the postseason?
Right.
The guy who scored 50 points in a finals game to close them out, guy Damian Lillard who's hit 2-game winners to win playoff series, or do you trust the young and upcoming Pacers? And so obviously you're always a challenger until you actually defeat someone or do it. But I would just say, caution everyone out there to say, 2 of these guys in this potential matchup are proven in the playoffs. The Pacers haven't been there. I mean, the last time they were there, I don't even think Tyrese Halliburton was in the NBA. And so it might have been
17
I'm like, I actually don't think he was in the NBA. The last time they made it was 2020.
You're right. Yeah, because the bubble.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, because that's why I can't forget it. T.J. Warren, shout out to all NBA bubble team, T.J. Warren. So that's my biggest thing is I know everyone's like, oh man, like we got the Bucks' number or they got the Bucks' number, but it's different in the playoffs, man. And I've seen it before. With teams like the Cavaliers, the LeBron teams,
right? And
where
that's
like
Pacers fans, Eddie's age and older, remember that. Because oftentimes, especially the Miami days, the Pacers got the better end of the Heat in the regular season series. And you think, okay, there's a formula here. And then playoff basketball arrives. And granted, by the time the Heat-Pacers rivalry was where it was, the Pacers had playoff experience. They were much older and more and wiser than this current Pacers team just in terms of playoff mileage. And they had previous battles with LeBron and with Miami. But that's what I keep giving pause to in my head is that's great that they dominated in the regular season, but to your end, and I think that there are pieces of this roster that are equipped for it. Miles Turner's been there before. Pascal Siakam has been there before and climbed the highest mountain. There is experience on this team, but you have to have some level of pause, no matter how confident you are in the Pacers, knowing that just because you got the regular season series, if that is the assignment you ultimately draw or the matchup you draw, that's your overall point there, James, that playoff basketball, it's just different. And that's why I said this yesterday. I'm probably crazy with this, but I am hopeful in the same way, not like leaps and bounds better, but you've seen guys like Steph, guys like Damian Lillard get just a little bit better defensively in the playoffs. Maybe it's just an extra possession or two. Not saying, again, I said this yesterday, they're not becoming Gary Payton, but they're getting just enough better to where you can't always pick on that mismatch. And if you can pick on the mismatch, the coaching is, as it's such an elite level, they have better ways of hiding.
Yeah, there's
guys
a lot
like
more
that.
scouting. Obviously, you have more days to prepare. You're more well rested. All these things change versus how you scout a team when you're coming off a back-to-back or your third game in 5 nights. Like, this won't be the case in the playoffs if the Pacers get there. And the other thing I'll add is with Halliburton, this is his chance to sort of arrive. And I was talking to Kenny Smith about this during the All-Star break, and he was like, classic line. He was like, you make your fame, you make your name in the playoffs.
Yep.
So he was like, as great as this guy is, and he mentioned this word diversification for Halliburton. He was talking about how he's a very unique star because he's an elite passer, but he also, when he wants to be, is an elite scorer. Like, Ty can go get you 40. We've seen it.
He had like an all-star replica performance in the early stage of the first quarter last night.
I was like, so I do think that he's someone, when the lights come on at their brightest, he'll be ready. But again, we can't say for sure just how good he is. And I know Reggie Miller was like, I think this guy can be the best player on the championship team. And that all sounds great, but Jason Tatum hasn't been the best player on the championship team yet. Luka hasn't been the best player on the championship team yet. So there are certain players out there where if you want to get in that conversation, you at least have to get to the playoffs and then sort of prove yourself. Because even when Luka earlier in his career wasn't getting out of the first round, the numbers he was putting up were historically great. And obviously Ty plays a different style of game, more of a pass-first player, but I do think this is his opportunity to, again, validate all the respect he's gained. And you see it. And I also even add this. It might not be linear. There are certain things you go through in the playoffs where you usually struggle and fail, or you don't have success, and you got to go back to the drawing board after falling from this steep, height. You go all the way back to, square one, and you start over in the offseason, and you figure out, okay, when I played this team in the playoffs, they shaded me this way, or they guarded me this way. This is how I beat it. I mean, we saw Dame shooting from half court in the All-Star game with ease, but I don't know if you all remember this, but when he was in Portland, they played New Orleans that one year in the playoffs. He could not do anything with how Drew Holiday back then, part of the Pelicans, was guarding him, and how they were basically picking him up from half court. He's like, you know what? The only way I can beat this is if I get more range. And so I would like to just see what Halliburton does, how he adjusts to the playoffs, and obviously how he builds his game from there, because every year we've seen a leap from him. Last year it was he's a pretty good player to an all-star. This season it's all-star to possibly all-NBA. And then now I think the question is, can you be, borderline top 10, top 12, and a guy that obviously makes your team a contender? So a lot to be said. Obviously a lot of more games to be played. They're not there yet. I think the way I look at Halliburton is that he's ascending, but he hasn't arrived by any stretch of my imagination. But it is exciting, I think, to sort of look at where this team was when he got here a few years ago. They lost their last 10 games when they traded for Halliburton that season. I was there. It was rough.
Yeah.
And then now, knock on some wood here, the only way they would lose 10 games is if all these guys got hurt or something like that. So they're for real. And I think it's fun to sort of have that resurgence. And I mean, I remember when they beat Phoenix a few weeks ago and Devin Booker had 62, it was so loud in there. It felt like a playoff game. And I think that this city, this state is kind of yearning for that again.
They've won 2 straight now, 3 of their last 4. And if you go back
2-game
from
winning
the
streak,
All-Star
baby.
break, 5 of their last 7. Yeah. 2-game winning streak. Maybe
It's a
that's something
streak.
to
It
hang a
counts.
banner about. It is a streak. But 5 of their last 7, that's going before the All-Star break as well. The more important note there. And they've been solid at home, 18-11 at home so far this season. On this homestand, still 3 games left to play. They will host Dallas on Sunday, then a back-to-back Monday against Toronto, followed by the final game of this homestand when they host New Orleans next Wednesday. So they have an opportunity to stack a couple more home wins before they have a little bit of a 3-game road trip sandwiched in there. And it's easier said than done, but the more you can stack wins, especially without Aaron Nesmith, and who knows, it might be I don't know if we have clarity on that just yet, Eddie, but it could be a still day-to-day game thing with him.
Right.
It could be, hey, maybe they see him in 2 games. Maybe it's on Sunday. No clarity there just yet, but whenever you get him back, you would think that adds another layer back to this team. And that's one last area on the Pacers that I want to get to, at least in this opening segment. From a distribution standpoint, in terms of impact players, yes, Tyrese has his 25, but he's not really impacted directly by the absence in terms of where the minutes are at from Aaron Nesmith. Bennett Mathurin into the starting lineup, and we'll start with that. Bennett Mathurin gets the nod to be back in the starting lineup. There are questions whether or not that would be the direction they would go, but he is ultimately the one they decide to. He has 15 points. He, wink, wink, wins the Jaden Ivey war because he outscored him by a point. That's all that matters, right? You can just close that book. We're good.
I don't know.
We'll start there. Bennett Mathurin, Ivey joke aside, he looked good last night.
Yeah, and I think he's better when he is in attack mode and sort of given more of an offensive load, to be honest. I think that there are still times where I wonder.
A couple head-scratching plays every now and again.
Yeah, and I guess my challenge to Benedict is there's 2 things. Number 1, stop complaining. Like, he does that a lot. And I say that because those are the possessions that get you beat in the playoffs. You waste 2 seconds yelling at the ref, they go down and hit a 3, momentum swings, crowds warm, whatever the case may be, you get beat like that. And I also think that, on a tangent to that, sometimes he doesn't always go to score or to make a play. It's like, I'm going to go to make them make a call. And so there's a line there that can kind of get lost if you're always doing that, to the point where even if you do get fouled, it's like, did you legitimately go up to actually do anything with it, though? And so I would love to see him, be more engaged and maybe just a little bit mentally tougher, and I guess more mature in that sense. And also, when he's playmaking, which he's shown the ability to do, so I know he's capable, but when he passes the ball, sometimes I'm like, are you just passing it because you ran out of, like, real estate and you couldn't get your shot off? Or are you actually passing to do it because it benefits the offense? And so that to me are the 2 things. But I thought that he was fine last night. Obviously, there's still room to grow. But like you said in the early part of this segment, the easiest path to them, or more realistic path to them becoming a legitimate contender with the next few years, is if he takes a leap forward and he becomes sort of that borderline, high-level role player, borderline star that can help them get over the top.
Still to come, again, we'll have a conversation with Isaac Trotter, top of the 1 o'clock hour. Nick Baumgardner going to join us top of the 2 o'clock hour, and then bottom of the 2 o'clock hour, Caitlin Cooper will join us, getting more in depth with that conversation with Caitlin regarding the Pacers and their win over the Pistons last night and what they have in front of them from a schedule standpoint as they try to more solidify where they are from a seeding standpoint. Still to come. In fact, coming up next, we'll talk a little bit about if we finally know what Purdue is, with just a couple games left in the regular season, and how much from James's seat seeding really matters in terms of where the Boilermakers could be on that one line. That and a look ahead to a monster weekend in college hoops. Still to come here on Query & Company, 93.5, 107.5 The Fan.
Diabetes, high blood pressure, anxiety.
Last night at West Lafayette, Purdue victorious with ease over Rutgers 96-68. I love just weird, unique stats, but for the Boilermakers, they've now won 117 straight games, James, when they score at least 90. I love weird, just out of nowhere stats. Last loss for the Boilers back in 1987. But I love a good, just weird stat. It's like, oh, okay, 90 points. But back to the seriousness of this game. And I want to get your thoughts on Purdue as a whole, because we do this thing, and I understand why we do it. And I understand why the Purdue fan base still expects it to happen. Not like how the season's going to end, but in terms of the reaction of things. Because they're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And even if they are viewed as the consensus number one overall seed right now, because that's what Lenardi has in his latest bracketology, and we kind of expected that the way UConn lost and the way Purdue responded from that loss to Ohio State. They're back in the driver's seat in terms of being a top overall seed. So a couple different angles I want to talk to you about this. But first, last night, and I'm going to go on record with this, and it's not a big leap to take.
Oh, man.
It's not a big leap to take. It's a very easy take, and that's why I want to get your thoughts on it. Is it too easy here? If Purdue shoots 50% from beyond the arc, if they shoot 90% from the foul line, and Zach Edey goes for 25 and 7, who's beating them? Like when they are on like that, and it's the Big Ten. I know Rutgers is not UConn, but it's the Big Ten, and you know you're going to get your best from the other side every night. And there were, again, whispers of question marks about the Boilermakers after the loss to Ohio State. And then here they are responding at home in their most dominant form, which is we have shooters that are better than they were a year ago. Once again, Lance Jones exists, and so does Zach Edey.
Yeah.
And they're going to be strong at the charity stripe. If they play like that, oh, and by the way, they only turn it over 11 times. Not a lot of teams are going to beat them. How easy is that take? And maybe the 18 of 20 part at the line isn't sustainable, but the volumes of high-quality three-point shots they take, that's not out of the question, that they could not have a 40% or sniffing a 50% night from beyond the arc in the tournament. That's not crazy.
It's not crazy. I think, obviously, your stance is a safe one far as some of those numbers.
I got a nice blanket over here.
I know.
I'm very comfortable. Yep.
But I'll add that what, to me, makes a difference is probably what they did defensively the most, because you're not going to shoot like that every night come tournament time. And I mean, even just in the Big Ten tournament, there's just going to be nights where you don't get your outside shots to drop, quite frankly, but you have to be able to lock up defensively, which they did. I don't know how to say Rutgers coach's name, Steve Pinkel? Pikel. He said, we're one of the best defensive teams in the country, and today we didn't have any answers. They went inside. They made free throws. They had threes.
He's not wrong about that. Steve Pikel's teams are physical, aggressive. They are the epitome of defense in the Big Ten.
But if you can be the more physical team, the more defensive team, the more dominant team, I mean, like you said, they have a chance to do something special. But I also wonder how much of it is psychological for the players too, because regardless of what happens the rest of the season, they're gonna be most likely a number one seed. Whether the consensus number one overall seed is, I guess, to be determined, but they'll probably be a number one seed. I think that's a safe bet.
Yes.
And now it becomes, okay, we heard everything from last year for so long. It's going to become the story no matter where you're seated or who you play, because the narrative is that you can't win when it matters the most. And I do think that outside shooting, of all the things you mentioned, I trust Zach Edey to put up big numbers because he's done it for a couple years now. He's actually better than he was last year, and he was a National Player of the Year last year. I trust that, they're probably going to make their free throws, but the three-point shot, especially in college basketball, is always the great,
equalizer.
Yes, and in a sense, it's like the one. It doesn't always equalize things because it makes you worse than you are, or makes a team that's
you
not.
fall in love with that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was watching. Actually, it was Nebraska and IU the other night.
Yeah.
One of the Nebraska players, I forget his name. He shot like 29% from three all year, and he goes like 5 for 5 against them, and they win the game handedly. So that could happen against you.
IU took like 27 and hit like 4.
Exactly. And this is why I think defensively, as long as the Boilermakers are locked in defensively, then that could be the difference in them advancing. Obviously, you have to make some shots, but you can't let these teams kind of take advantage of you. And I think Lance Jones makes a huge difference defensively. And, Braden Smith being a year smarter, stronger, more poised, Fletcher Lawyer, all those guys, they matter, man. But, I mean, that was as impressive as a victory as you're going to see from a team in their own conference. This team knows who you are. They've scouted you. They're not surprised by anything, but they just looked totally dominant in that game. And, obviously for Boilermaker fans, they would love for that to be a preview of the tournament, but we just don't know. That's why I love March, because it's crazy. You can think one thing, and with one bad shooting day, one bad turnover, whatever the case may be, even just one human game from Zach Edey where he doesn't have 25 and 10, and what if he only has 19 and 12, 19 and 8? Like, is that enough for you to? Do you have enough to win without superstar Edey? I don't know. So we'll see. But I think that if I am a Boilermaker fan, which I'm not, by the way, but if I am. I feel pretty good about that win.
He's not an Indiana fan
but,
either, for those concerned.
How about those Illini the other night?
Look, I'm just glad that I guess I'm in the world of like sports media now, where I don't actually cheer as much as I used to, because that would, to me, would be so painful. I was thinking about like my diehard Illinois fans.
Oh, it's a brutal loss.
Because, I mean, the narrative after Purdue lost was, oh, man, can Illinois catch them for the Big Ten, regular season title? And then they go out there and they lose to Penn State in like the last minute, and it's like, oh, that was fun while it lasted. So getting back to Purdue, I think they're fine. But like you said, you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. But maybe it drops in a good direction this year.
Or it drops in a different round. Like, here's another safe take, and I've said this a couple times, not because I enjoy making skin crawl for Purdue fans. I'm genuinely being serious about this. Mathematically speaking, I know people hate when we bring math.
I was going to say, use analytics. No, I'm joking.
Mathematically speaking, they're not losing in the first round this year. It's mathematically impossible. It's happened twice in 270, whatever the stat is. I used to know it off the top of my head.
It's a good thing basketball's not a math sport, Jimmy.
Yeah, I understand. But
get him, Eddie. Get him.
What you should be more worried about if you're a Purdue fan, or maybe not, because when I look at a preview of their potential bracket, and yes, we're in that season now. We are, more math here. I know everybody's very excited. We are 4 weeks away, give or take, from Selection Sunday. This is now no longer a hobby of, what's happening with Lenardi? What's Jerry Palmbright? No, we're outside of that. What's Mike DeCourcy got? That's no longer a joke because it's November. It's February 23rd. Everything has hit the fan now. It's real. And while the positioning on the bracket might not be accurate from Joe Lenardi, he's usually pretty accurate with who makes the field and about where their seed line is. And you talk about the importance of getting the top overall seed. And we had Bruce Weber on yesterday. Shout out to you. And he spoke about whether or not he cared in regards to seeding as a coach. And he said no, especially a 1 seed is a 1 seed. It's great, but it's more a media conversation than it is the coaches. And I get that. They're just ready to go play the games. But when you look at who Purdue could potentially face if they get the number 1 overall seed and they're in the Midwest Regional, Alabama already beat them. Marquette already beat them. Those are the top 2 and 3 seeds that you would potentially face if Lenardi is dead on across the board with this. So there is some sense of, and I don't know where you sit on this, James, of, it's tough to beat a good team twice. I get it. It's a rematch. There's time for adjustments. But at the same time, there is a level of familiarity there. And on neutral courts, it's not like it was in Mackey. You have significant wins against teams that very well could wind up in your region. That's hard not to. Players aren't going to look ahead, but it's hard not from a fan perspective. If you're a Purdue fan starting to really consume all this, to think, man, that's not a bad bracket. You're looking at Oklahoma or New Mexico in the round of 32, and then a combination of Dayton or McNeese State or Baylor or UC Irvine in this Sweet 16. That's appealing. I know we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit, but that's where you should be at if you're a Purdue fan. I'm not saying don't focus on the Big Ten tournament and focus on winning more hardware, but this team is bigger than that. This
Literally.
team, with how they're built and the opportunity in front of them, is bigger than just adding another Big Ten trophy to the case at West Lafayette.
I agree with that, mainly because How many teams can say they have the National Player of the Year and then they come back and they get better?
Short list.
And so I think that when we look back on the Zach Edey era, you want to be able to say you got something out of that, even if it is just a Final Four, and I say just a Final Four, but, obviously they aspire to win it all. They have a team good enough to do so, but it will be kind of weird to look back on this era of Zach Edey and the Boilermakers and say that they never really had that tournament run. And they've had some crazy fortune or misfortune over the years. I still think back to the Carson Edwards Virginia game, and I'm like, I thought for sure, okay, they're seconds away from going to the Final Four. The monkey's off of Matt Painter's back, and Virginia's like, And so that
I heard no fat lady. We still got
exactly.
time.
And so I think that changes things, and you want to be able to look back on this time and say you maximized it, and that you don't wish, if we would have had this happen, or if we had one more shot. Like, this is it, man. And obviously they're going to be a good program regardless. They have a lot of talent coming in every year. They've been one of the best programs in the country, especially over the last decade, as far as just stability and steadily always winning. However, to win at the biggest and highest level, you have the team to do it. You have the player to do it. And now it's about just getting the job done. And you have the coach do it, I believe. There's a lot of people, after last season's loss, season-ending loss that is, where they were like, oh, Matt Painter, is he the right guy for the job? Dude, it can get a lot worse than him.
Oh, yeah.
A lot worse than him. However, I'm sure he knows, and as a competitor, he probably feels it too. I coach my butt off every day with these guys. We got to go out there and prove it. And so, yes, regular season Big Ten title, great. Potential tournament, Big Ten title, fantastic. But we all know with this team and that program, it's bigger than that. And, I know for a lot of IU fans, they're like just waiting for Purdue to fail so they can get their jabs in. And I don't blame you. Look, I am the king of petty. So if my team is doing bad and your team loses in the first round, I don't care. We both together. We both at home.
But there are layers to that conversation. Like, for example, there will be criticism, rightfully so, if Purdue misses out on a Final Four run. But you can criticize a team while still acknowledging and maybe removing blame necessarily from Matt Painter if that happens.
Yeah, but it's hard.
No, it is.
It's hard.
It's hard in today's society, but internally with Purdue, if you talk to people around the program, they know what Matt Painter means to Purdue. He's the living embodiment of Purdue the same way Gene Cady was, and they're a standard in the Big Ten. Like it or not, even if you want to shrink it down the last 3 or 4 years, not just the entire history of Purdue basketball. And I know they don't have the banners to show it or the Final Four appearances to show it. No, but at the same time, they are the pinnacle of what it means to succeed in that conference. To do well in the Big Ten.
I would say in the last,
and to be a perennial right there in the conversation. So you can and that will happen. If they fall short, it'll happen on the show. There will be criticism against why they weren't able to do it. If that happens, I argue the fact that you never know what the crapshoot of the NCAA tournament is going to give you. Sometimes you just get a bad matchup, and we've seen arguably better teams than Purdue have tough matchups and fall short. But currently, that's not a worry. That is a couple exits down the road. They still have everything in front of them for this season. And regardless of how it ends, whether it's a Final Four, whether it's a national championship, whether it's an early exit, I think there is a way to have a nuanced conversation about it while acknowledging a shortcoming without fully saying, hey, Matt Painter is not the guy.
So I do want to come back to this, but I'll say this real quick. Just your quick thoughts. What do you think is more likely, that they lose in the first 2 rounds or they get to, let's say, an Elite Eight?
More likely they get to an Elite Eight. I mean, you obviously have to see the draw, but I don't think this is a team that misses out on the second weekend. I think they get there.
I agree.
I think missing out on the second weekend would be, now you're talking about a really tough failure where questions have to be asked.
Yeah, that's fair.
We can dive deeper into that model, and that's an interesting conversation because a lot of people, depending on your prism, don't view the tournament in a bottle like that. A lot of people say body of work. That's kind of where I lean, which is why you give the credit and you tip the cap for what a great coach Matt Painter is. We'll dive more into that with Isaac Trotter, though, national college basketball writer, at the top of the hour. Maybe a little bit more college hoops, including a big matchup for Butler this weekend, and an early look at Combine next week with James Boyd. I'm Jimmy Cook, Query and Company on The Fan.
Hey, it's JMV for CarX. Winter driving.
This a little bit more with Isaac Trotter, national college basketball writer, joining us top of the hour, 10 minutes from now, in fact. But for the Butler Bulldogs, the tournament resume, which I thought was pretty solid in terms of getting in the field just 3 or 4 weeks ago, now suddenly in jeopardy. Again, he is not the be-all, end-all when it comes to the selection committee, but Joe Lunardi currently has Butler. They were as high as the top line of the last 4 in earlier this week. They're now the bottom of the first 4 out behind Utah, Ole Miss, and Wake Forest. Seton Hall currently occupies that spot where Butler was. And, oh, look at that. Butler-Seton Hall this Saturday at Seton Hall on the road, a quad 1 opportunity for Butler. So we'll talk more about that game itself and what it would mean for the Bulldogs to end what has been a 6-year drought since their last March Madness appearance. They, like many, had a pretty good team when the tournament was upended by COVID and was canceled. And obviously nobody got NCAA tournament bids there, but 'tis his life. That's where things are at for them. It's been a 6-year drought, and through a couple of head coaches now with Thad Matta in year 2, ahead of expectations, an opportunity for Butler to seize that and win over Seton Hall. I'm not saying it necessarily locks it down for the Bulldogs, but you look at who they have left, St. John's, DePaul, Xavier, they'd be in pretty good driving position if they're able to beat the Pirates.
Yeah, we had Nick Gardner on earlier in the week, and he pretty much said that if Butler, and John Fanta said the same thing, essentially, if Butler loses against Seton Hall, there's nothing left on their schedule for them to provide clarity as to the committee as to them being a tournament team.
The only thing
they have to win.
Right. The only thing that is left is the Big East tournament. And again, that's just not been a place where they have thrived in the decade that they have been there. You get to 20 wins. That's another part John Fanta had mentioned was you get to 20. I think he said only one Big East team ever has missed out on the tournament with 20 wins, and that would be what Butler is at if they close out in a 4-game winning streak. So we'll see what happens with the Bulldogs. Quick look here, and we only have about 2 minutes before we got to go to break. So, James, I'll leave the ball fully in your court. Your early thoughts on the combine itself, you can take that any direction. It being here in Indianapolis and them getting that contract extension yet again from the NFL, the value of the Colts, the Brock Bowers rumors, anywhere you want to go with that in terms of what you're focused on for the combine, and we'll expand on that as the day goes on.
I'll definitely be keeping an eye on Brock Bowers just because I've seen him mocked enough by legitimate people to now, at first I was like, there's no chance he falls to 15. Now I'm like, is there a chance? How realistic is it? I'll have more on that actually later on, or early next week. But I think that he's the most intriguing prospect for them, mainly because they don't actually need, I wouldn't say like the tight end's like their biggest need, but you look at his talent, I just wonder if they go best player available if he's there. So we'll see. But there's other things to look at as well. I'm curious to see like what, wide receivers might catch the eye of Reggie Wayne. I'll be talking to a couple different wide receivers, like who have you spoke to with the Colts? Is it Reggie? What did he say? Because as we know from last year, he vouched a lot for Josh Downs, and he ended up being the guy that they chose and ended up having a really good rookie season. So we'll see. But I guess what's weird for me is I don't really have much direction this year, which I guess is a good thing because I can float around to like edge rushers, to wide receivers, to defensive backs because they have the quarterback and they have the coach. And so last year it was so simple in the sense of, okay, quarterback talks this day at this time. You're going to do all these different things about quarterback. And now it's how do you build the right pieces around that guy? And so I'm excited to talk to Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen, I believe on Wednesday of this upcoming week. And so that should be a good time to get the ball rolling for Combine Weekend, pivot from All-Star Weekend to now being, another week of sleepless nights as far as the Combine goes. But I'm excited for it and obviously grateful for the opportunity.
Subscribe to The Athletic if you haven't already. Follow James' work there. You can get it on Twitter as well at RomeoVille Kid. We're going to step aside. We come back. Isaac Trotter covers college basketball for 24/7 Sports. We'll get his perspective on Purdue and their quest for the top overall seed, as well as where teams like Butler and Indiana State stand in their quest to make it to the big dance. Isaac Trotter, 24/7 Sports, joins us next on Query and Company.
The Pacers are breaking all the rules.
Still here, vibing out in the DriveHuler.com studio. I'm James Boyd alongside Jimmy Cook, Eddie Garrison, listen to Query and Company. And this is, that was quite the intro there, Eddie. I like that. For those who cannot listen to the music, on the podcast, things like that, it was Usher, yeah.
Eddie spins on Friday.
I know.
This.
I was like, man, I feel like I'm in a club. What's going on? So, obviously, we have had a lot of fun talking about Purdue, IU. Maybe not as much fun with IU because of what's going on there. Butler, Indiana State. A lot of things going on as far as the tournament goes, or tournament seeding and potential seeding goes. And we have my buddy Isaac Trotter on the line from 24/7 Sports. I know Isaac from college, and I guess we're adults now with jobs. So, Isaac, how you doing?
Doing well, man. Good to talk with you again.
So, obviously, Isaac, I know you've been keeping up with a lot of things Big Ten. I won't start with our Illini, which, bothered me the other night. But I will start with Purdue. Where do you think this team has grown the most from last season to this season, which could possibly make things different, obviously, come tournament time?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think a lot of people entered this year going, hey, this is the same team with a lot of the same faces, and they're going to have the same issues. I think Purdue has gotten a lot better in their lead guard play. Braden Smith has really elevated from, I think a lot of people had questions about him as if he's going to be a Big Ten starter. Well, he answered those last year. Like, he's a good Big Ten starter. This year, he's elevated into a completely different tier. He's arguably one of the best 5-point guards in all of college basketball. And that mid-range pull-up jumper that he's able to get to just is so nasty. Like, that was a weakness last year. He spent all summer long, all off season trying to hone that with his dad, doing a lot of workouts with him. And it's become a huge, huge strength. And I think that has really changed the complexion of this team because you can get so many free throws and so many shots at the rim with Zach Edey, and you're going to get really good open looks from three. But being able to differentiate your shot diet and having those mid-range pull-ups has really changed how you have to guard Purdue, how you have to guard their ball screens. And it's really been a big game changer. And then secondly is Lance Jones, just that added one more ball handler who is electric in transition, can really get out and run and knock down those catch-and-shoot threes before defenses can get set. That's nasty. And, like, when you can dominate in half court and then you have a little bit of transition offense to go with it with Lance Jones, that's a really, really good combination for a Purdue team that I think has everything it takes to win the national title.
Follow up to that, Zach Edey, the narrative around here for people who may not like him or for the Boilermakers, he's just big. What makes him special besides his size? Because we have seen even a jump from last year to this year, even after winning the National Player of the Year last year.
Yeah, I think he's probably the best conditioned athlete in all of college basketball. And that's saying something, right? Like, you're 7'4", you're 300 pounds, and his ability to run the floor like he does every single time, take the beating he does, attack the offensive glass, get back and also, rip down defensive rebounds. Like, he's playing 36 minutes a night, 42 minutes a night in overtime against Northwestern, like 35 against Indiana, like every single night to do that. Like, we don't see that throughout college basketball. Guys that big usually don't play this many minutes and play as hard as he does. So I think he has really elevated from a conditioning standpoint. His lateral movement is better. His rim protection has been better. Honestly, offensively lately, I haven't loved everything he's done. He was a lot better against Rutgers, but before that, he had struggled a little bit with some turnovers, some weird shots that you'd expect him to make that he was missing in the paint. But defensively and everything else-wise, he's checked off a ton of boxes, and I think that's why you're seeing him in that first-round mock drafts. Where legitimate NBA guys are really tied in, are saying, like, this guy is potentially, a first-round pick, potentially even maybe a top 20 pick. And I think it's all warranted from all of the work that he's done to change his body and really change his game to become an even more modern big man, despite, not being like hey, I'm a big who's going to go out and shoot 40% from three on a lot of high volume.
National college basketball writer for 24/7 Sports, Isaac Trotter, is our guest. Sticking with Purdue, Isaac, there has been a habit because of how good they've been, and it's a good problem to have because they only have 3 losses on the season, but there's been a habit of trying to find ways to beat Purdue and kind of classic, as happens in today's media cycle, overreactions after the losses. There also could be, though, overreactions after the wins because, as James and I talked about to start the show, yes, Steve Pike was a great coach. Rutgers is always a physical team. They are the epitome of Big Ten basketball, especially on the defensive end, and Purdue had their way with them from start to finish last night. They go 90% from the foul line and 52% from three. If they play like that, no one's beating them. Like if Zach Edey goes for 25 and they're as effective as they were from beyond the arc and don't have hiccups taking care of the basketball or at the foul line, nobody's beating them, and that's the reaction from a win over Rutgers. When you look at the ebbs and flows, because you cover this on a daily basis, where is the appropriate reaction for Purdue as they stand with 4 games to play, 3 of which are in quad 1 territory because of where the Big Ten has allotted itself this year?
I think Purdue has really had a hard time figuring out its rotation at times. Yes, they're 24-3. Yes, they've won all these games. Yes, it's played well. But lately, I think they're kind of trying to tinker and find what their best 5-man lineup is. And from one game perspective against Rutgers, I think they found it a little bit with Camden Heide really asserting himself. I love that dude. Like, I think he is like a redshirt freshman who has just gotten better and better. And yes, it's great when you make shots and then threes go in, like you look better. But just the bounce that he has, the athleticism that he gives them, we talk a little bit more about that transition offense. I think he gives them a spark there. Like, you have to guard him too. And I like his defense too. I think he's had moments where he has really moved his feet well. So from a big picture standpoint, I think Purdue is starting to find that lineup that they really like. Because if Cam Heide becomes this piece that, hey, when Fletcher Loyer is struggling, or hey, those big wings are giving Fletcher Loyer some trouble, if you can go to Cam Heide and you don't necessarily have to go to Ethan Morton, I just feel like the offense moves a little bit better. It flows a little bit easier. And it's just another piece that another arrow, so to speak, that Matt Painter and his coaching staff can really go to in that arsenal and just have something different, have those counters so that they can win games in different ways. Because I think we all know, like, you have to win 6 different games in 6 different ways to win it all in March. And I think Purdue is starting to find that rhythm a little bit more and find ways to win when it's not just the Zach Edey show and when it's not just the Braden Smith show and when it's not just the Lance Jones show. They can do a lot of different things now.
It feels like we've reached a point in the season where, yes, there's clear separation for Houston and UConn and Purdue, but you never know what the tournament itself is going to draw. You throw Kansas in there as well. There's also times, though, where it looks like a parity-filled season of college basketball where maybe anything can happen, and this could be the wide-open type of March Madness that fans, those that cover the sport, love. For those that are on top of the landscape for this season in a vacuum, how much more value, if at all, is there on securing the consensus number 1 overall seed in the tournament if you're UConn, or locally based if you're Purdue?
I think it's a big advantage this year, especially, because I genuinely think that, between number 4 nationally and maybe number 30 nationally, I don't think that gap is very big. Like, the 4th best team in college basketball, maybe that's Arizona. Like, they're a really good team who I think is in that top tier, but they're not, this world beater that can't ever be touched by anybody. They lost at home last night to Washington State. So I think if you're Purdue and you put yourself in position to win that number 1 overall seed, which I think they are pretty well positioned to do, right? Like, coming down the stretch, if they beat Michigan State, Illinois, Wisconsin, even if they win 2 out of those 3 games, you're talking about, a quad 1 record that's just absurd. You go into the Big Ten tournament, go on a run there, you're probably going to lock up that number 1 seed. They have a better resume than UConn. You can debate whether UConn might be the better team or whether Purdue's the better team, but I think Purdue clearly has the better resume with those remaining games to potentially seal that number 1 overall seed. And if they do get that, I really do think it is a big advantage, just because the gap between, that 3 and 30, like I was talking about, isn't all that wide, and you have to give yourself the best chance every single night. And there's some scary 8 seeds and there's some scary 9 seeds out there. But I'm telling you what, everybody is more scared of Purdue than they should be of anybody else. I guarantee that. Those conversations are happening in those coaches' offices. Nobody wants to be in that 8 or 9 bracket with Purdue on the other side of it, especially if you don't have a center that can really, like, be up to task with the physical assault that Edey and even Trey Kaufman-Renn can really bring on you.
To pivot from Purdue to IU for just a second here, obviously IU has not had the season they wanted to have. We knew they would take a step back after losing 2 NBA players. However, what do you think is the reason why they've maybe regressed to this degree, Isaac, where it's almost been sort of unrecognizable what this program has put out there, put on display, even the other night losing to Nebraska at home?
Yeah, I think it goes back to just the portal and the game plan in it. I didn't love the way that this roster was constructed, but also Indiana really wanted Dalton Connect, and that was the guy that they looked at in the portal and were like, this is the piece that could really change our team. And they just couldn't get it. Tennessee was the school that really put the most effort in there, and Indiana couldn't really get back in the mix with Tennessee. And he ends up going there and has a great year. And a part of me wonders, like, how different would we feel about Mike Woodson and this whole program if they get involved? Like, because he's maybe a top 15 pick, probably the best transfer in all of college basketball this year. So I think they knew what they needed, which was that versatile three who could really handle it, potentially go get his own bucket at times, and be that shot maker that clears room for Malik Renew and Khalil Ware to really assert themselves. And when they weren't able to get it, Mackenzie Mgbako was a solid pivot point to it, but this group just has a lot of power forwards on the floor, and they don't have enough skill, and they don't have enough playmaking off the bounce. And, I think they definitely thought that they were going to get a different version of Xavier Johnson than what's happened. And Trey Galloway's had moments this year where he's been fine, but, Indiana's multiple guards away, and college basketball is a guards game more than ever. Indiana's bigs are talented, but their guard play, it might not be the worst in the Big Ten, but it's near the bottom of the league, and that's just shouldn't happen. It just can't happen at a program like Indiana with the resources that they have.
Well, there's my issue looking towards next year. And from your national seat, Isaac Trotter joins us, national college basketball writer for 24/7 Sports. Ja'Kai Newton ends up getting hurt before the season starts. I don't see any of him. Mike Woodson is set on record, which I have a hard time with it, and it's just a tough look for the program. But he said on record earlier this week that he didn't anticipate Jalen Hood-Schifino leaving after 1 year. He thought he was going to be a 2-year guy, but you highlighted it. They tried to address it in the portal. You look at next year, Ja'Kai Newton, you're hoping, I guess, for a leap forward from Gabe Cupps, and maybe he will be. I think he projects as a nice player in the Big Ten, but he's got to put on more muscle, and he needs to continue to grow. But that's a lot to ask out of even a sophomore, and they don't have a signature guard on the recruiting trail next year. So once again, it comes down to the portal. Let's say, for the sake of argument, Isaac, Mgbako stays, Renew stays, where goes the NBA? If they don't have a guard, but they're adding Liam McNeely, what changes for this group? Because that's where I have a problem. I can stomach a bad season, but I worry if you still don't have the guard play, you're going to be in the same boat as you are right now.
No, no question. You're right on the money. And the thing is I think that the presence of Xavier Johnson and Trey Galloway certainly impacted potential transfers who are looking at Indiana going, hey, like, that's great. I want to come there, but, like, am I going to get to play? So Xavier Johnson leaves. I don't think anybody's going to look. I mean, people will want to play with Trey Galloway. He's a winning player, I think, who legitimately we've seen him play on really good teams with a lot of talent and find ways to make other guys better. But I don't think anybody's going to look at this rest of Indiana's backcourt and be super scared that they're going to lose minutes. So I expect Indiana to go in the portal, and I think that they're going to be big game hunting for some of the best lead guards in the sport. And you got to do that. And if you could insert a big-time lead guard, I mean, there were a lot of great lead guards in this last cycle. I think a lot of coaches that I've talked to are expecting, I asked, hey, is this guy entering the portal? Hey, is this person entering the portal? The answer I usually get is, yes, everyone's entering the portal. So, like, if you go into this next portal cycle and get one of those top guards, and you have McNeely and you have, Mgbako, maybe you slide him to the 4, and then you have Renew at the 5, I think you could see Indiana start to get back to shooting more threes and playing a little bit, more new age basketball instead of the constant 18-foot 2-point jumpers that it feels like Indiana's shot diet is just filled with this year.
Isaac, we got Butler at Seton Hall, I believe Saturday night. I see in your latest piece you said this isn't a playing game, but it feels like it. Both teams are desperate. Only so much time to sort of shore this thing up or make a run if you're Thad Matta and company. What is the key to possibly doing so when their defense has obviously let them down in some big moments this season?
Yeah, the rim defense this year just hasn't been good enough, and I think that they're going to be really challenged. This Seton Hall team, we talk about like football teams that like to drive the foot or like to run the ball. This is a Seton Hall team that wants to drive the basketball. They will get downhill and they will get to the rim at will. And Kadari Richmond's been one of the best players in the sport. I think he's a pro too, 6'6", 205-pound wing. So Butler's guards and their wings are going to be really challenged by this Seton Hall group. And that's a tough team. Shaheen Holloway does a really good job with that Seton Hall team of just establishing toughness, and they play with an edge. So Butler has to be the aggressor in that matchup. And Butler struggled at times on the road lately too. But it is one of those situations where we can't lose sight of the big picture, I think, with Butler. Like, overall, this has been a pretty positive year for them. The fact that they're in the mix after everything that they've been through. We've seen a lot of teams have to go into the portal and completely revamp their rosters. And so the fact that they're competitive is a pretty great sign. When I looked up the stats, if you brought in 7 or more transfers this year, all 8 of those teams from the high major ranks aren't NCAA tournament teams this year. And Butler brought in 6, so they didn't quite qualify, but they're right in the mix for it. So I think overall, Mata's done a really good job with this group, but you've got to find a way to win this game. And if you do, you're probably beating St. John's, you're probably beating DePaul, you probably can beat Xavier, and you start feeling good about yourself heading into Big East play and give yourself a chance to get in that large bid.
Yeah, it feels like this is legitimately, as James outlined there, the play-in game before the play-in game, because you're able to really solidify your resume and get yourself running downhill with, as you mentioned, St. John's, DePaul, and Xavier to play. Let's play out the doomsday scenario, though, for Butler. And I say that only because of the missed opportunity. I'm with you. With what Thad Matta's done in year 2, they're way ahead of expectations. I know the fan base is hungry to get back there. It's been 6 years since they've been a part of March Madness, but if it goes south for them to close, once that dust settles, you have to be pretty happy with the season they've had. That said, it's all still in front of them, but doomsday, they lose to Seton Hall. They close, win over St. John's, a quad 2 win, not majorly significant. Win over DePaul. We had John Fanta on the other day, and he basically said you'd be better off paying DePaul not to play that game in terms of what it actually does for Butler from a resume standpoint, because you lose it, it's a death sentence, and you win it, and okay, good, you took care of business against one of the worst teams in college basketball. And then Xavier at home, say they go 3-1, but they lose Seton Hall. I know you're not a bracketologist necessarily, but you follow this enough, Isaac. Realistically, how much noise would they have to make in the Big East tournament to get back in the conversation and making the dance? Or because they've lost to Seton Hall, who is a fellow bubble team, they already have a tough uphill climb to begin with?
Yeah, I think it really would come down to who their draw is in the Big East tournament. Like if I'm Butler in that scenario, I'm begging for a chance to play UConn, Marquette, or Creighton, right? Like you really want to play one of those teams, and if you could beat one of those teams and get a chance to play another one, that would be awesome as well. Just neutral site against high level quad 1 wins. That would be the path to it. And then you kind of look around the bubble, like there's plenty of opportunities for both Butler and Seton Hall to sneak into this field too. So I don't think it necessarily is one or the other, because certain other teams could fall off the page. And if you look at Butler's overall resume, they really have done a good job of not having those terrible losses. They just kind of need to rack up those wins. I think they're 4-10 in quad 1 games so far this year. So if you head into the Big East tournament, you're just begging for a chance to play one of those 3 elite teams at the top and hoping for a shot to potentially get 1 or maybe even 2 to feel better about yourself on Selection Sunday. And if the fact that Butler's even thinking about a Selection Sunday berth is a huge win this year. And I know the program wants to get in and everything, but the fact that they're thinking about it, I really do think says a lot about where this program is headed and what they can do next year, because their sell in the portal heading into next year is so much better than what it was last year. And that's a really huge key.
So for those listening, they may not know this, but Isaac was a bruiser when we played basketball back in college. My chest was never hurt by him because I got out of the way. And so in that same vein, Isaac, jokes aside, who do you think is sort of like that tough bully team that could go on a run and have a chance to make some noise come March because of their style of play and their physicality, and maybe it's just because they just want it more than the other guy?
Well, I mean, that's a great point. There's a couple of teams out there that I look at. The normal one is Houston, right? Like, they are legitimate hyenas. They play like they want to rip your head off, and they want to kill you with offensive rebounds, and they will laugh at you on the way off the floor because they just punked you for 40 minutes. Like, they are so physical. The other team, though, that plays a lot like it with a little bit more skill is Florida, one of the best offensive rebounding teams in college basketball. I think, they offensive rebound like 40% of their chances. It's just absurd what they're able to do. And they have some really great guard play with it's deep. So that's a group that, if they get into the tournament as a 7, 8, 9 seed, I'm going to be looking hard and long at them at putting them in the second weekend, because they continue to be one of those teams that I just really genuinely like. Maybe I'm off on my own island, but just everything I see with them is great guard play. These forwards that just chase every offensive rebound down. You just feel them every time they play. Like, they'll leave cuts and bruises all over the floor. Like, that's a really good group. So I'm going to have a hard time keeping Florida out of that second weekend in my bracket. And I have a feeling it's going to probably be more mainstream. That take will be mainstream in a couple weeks.
See, that's what I like to hear right there. I'm telling you, this dude used to play so hard. I remember thinking like, oh, no, my insurance is not that good. you ain't about to hurt me. And so I was very diplomatic in my approach to loose balls and things like that with Isaac Trotter on the floor. That was a real thing.
You got high basketball IQ, James. I don't think any of us
I got common sense.
Common sense, for sure. Isaac Trotter joins us, national college basketball writer for 24/7 Sports. Isaac, kind of a two-part question in regards to conferences. The Big East, from the advanced metric standpoints, the net, quad one wins, all that good stuff, they have been viewed by many in that vein as one of the best conferences in college basketball. But there's a ton of top-level action from Power 5 schools. Where in your mind, A, is the best conference as it stands for the 23-24 campaign with only a couple games left to play? And secondly, where is this can be mid-major, this can be top level, where's the best conference tournament we need to circle? Because I'll watch them all, but from your perspective, where's the best conference tournament in the coming weeks we should have our eyes on that maybe we don't have already?
Yeah, I think the Big 12 is probably college basketball's best conference. I think the SEC for me would probably be second. I think that league, everyone thinks of them as a football league, but the commitment to basketball from the NIL perspective has been a real thing, and it's not just Kentucky. We've seen teams like South Carolina, Auburn, those two teams were kind of in the middle of the pack at the beginning of the year. They've really, really improved. So I think that SEC is a lot better from a basketball perspective. But, I mean, like you said, championship week coming up, that's one of the most fun times of the year when you can just watch all these tournaments. If you're not watching Mountain West basketball, you are missing out on just a delightful conference. Like, all of these leagues are really good, but the Mountain West has just some special home court advantages. They have guards who have played there for a while, like Jalen House at New Mexico. He's kind of a spaz on the floor, and he knows like the weaknesses and strengths of almost every player he goes against, like, because he's played against them forever. And so he's screaming like, I'm in his head all the time about Jared Lucas from Nevada, who they've hooped against each other for multiple years in a row. And this is a league that's been super competitive. They have 7 teams within one game of the conference title. Like, they could have 6 teams in the NCAA tournament. So that at-large case for all of those teams would be strengthened if you don't have to worry about it. You could win that league. So you could go into the conference tournament there in the Mountain West with 7-8 teams that could potentially win it all, and that's pretty surprising. So I expect major fireworks in that league, and it's been awesome all year long throughout the regular season, and I expect that conference tournament to just be sick.
So last one from me, brother. I'm curious to know, Isaac, what is the setup when it comes to tournament time, March Madness? Because for so long, we were just sneaking and watching games in class. Those times have kind of shifted, a few years removed from that at this point. But what is the setup for a person who is a national college basketball writer for 24/7 Sports, and you have to literally keep up with everything that happens? Do you have 4 screens? Do you have 3 screens? Do you have
multi-view,
the phone?
maybe?
Yeah, multi-view. What is the setup, the hookup?
All right, so I need YouTube TV to pay me because I like that YouTube TV 4-screen setup big time. That's huge. And then I have that broadcast open up on my laptop with 6 or 7 there, and then my notes app open to write notes while I'm watching. There's a method to the madness. It's pure hell, to be honest, though. It's just so many games and so many teams and so many names. I'm constantly logging into Synergy at 10 o'clock at night or 7 a.m. in the morning to rewatch games that I couldn't catch. But yeah, I'm excited for March Madness just like everybody else. And that 4-screen view on YouTube TV is pretty clutch. And I could use a sponsorship, to be honest, while we're here.
I'll have my people talk to their people, and we'll get that situated for you nice and quick, Isaac. But jokes aside, my man, thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon, and have fun with March Madness. I'll be more of a fan. You'll be working, but I got to imagine you're pretty happy about that.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Isaac.
Again, that was Isaac Trotter, reporter for 24/7 Sports, covers college basketball on a national level. And I find that stuff fascinating because I think of my job as a reporter, what my setup is during a game. And, when I cover the Colts, I'm only focused on that one game. I can't imagine having to be an expert pretty much on every top team in the country. Yeah. I consider myself to be sort of an expert on the AFC South, but even then, it's a lot. But I think he made some good points about where Purdue is, teams being more afraid of them than them being afraid of other teams, and maybe the letdown that could happen. But, man, I just feel like we're right there. And as soon as that calendar flips to March, it's put up or shut up, which is my favorite time of the year because we can talk like we're doing today about all these things that could happen, and then we finally get to see, okay, who is actually going to respond.
He's not wrong about the YouTube TV thing, though. Multi-view is clutch, and he's also not wrong about, I myself, I think I speak for all YouTube TV subscribers. Hey, I wouldn't mind a little sponsorship deal there for the Multiview because it's critical. It is critical for March Madness and big-time sporting events. We're going to step aside. When we come back, we'll shift towards the Colts. This is one of those great moments. It's always great to have James Boyd in studio, but it's especially great when some news breaks. We have salary cap numbers that broke at the top of the hour, but not only that, we now know how it impacts franchise tag conversation. We'll dive into that when we come back here on Query and Company on 93.5, 107.5 The Fan.
Let Bill Estes put you behind the wheel of the powerhouse.
Eddie Garrison rolling on a Friday. A little stronger for the podcast audience. Don't get to hear the music. With James Boyd, I'm Jimmy Cook. This is Query and Company. If you're not, the namesake himself, Jake Query, will be back on Monday. Just enjoying a quick little trip to Las Vegas. See some U2. Hope he and Shannon enjoy that show. Back here locally, though, numbers released at the top of this past hour, so right around 30 minutes ago, of where the NFL's salary cap will be. My goodness. Just printing money. Record-setting cap number, $255.4 million is the salary cap. And now we have officially, regardless of, oh, there it is. Yes. We're in Vegas for Jake, and we're in Vegas for the cap. I give a tip of the cap. No pun intended. Sorry about that. Teddy Garrison there for the sound effects. But we also now have, regardless of how much it's actually tied to it or not, we have official numbers now, James, on where the franchise tag will be by position, and that impacts the Colts in a big way.
Yes, it is now set at $21.8 million for wide receiver. And I don't know if you heard this, but Michael Pittman Jr. is a wide receiver.
What?
And a pretty good one. And I wrote about this, actually, in a piece I just put out for The Athletic 10-part plan for the offseason. Now, I will say this. For those of you who have read it, I am not a GM. If they don't do any of the steps, totally fine with me. I was just thinking to myself, hey, fun exercise, gets me thinking about the season. But obviously, step number one is to find a way to get a long-term deal done with your top wideout. And within that first step, the first thing to do, in my opinion, would be to franchise tag him. Because I think it would be a bad negotiation tactic on both sides if either just agrees to the first thing thrown out. If you're Michael Pittman Jr., you're like, give me $110 million for 4 years, $100 million for 4 years, and I'm good. If you're the Colts, you're like, I don't know if you're worth that much. You're really good, though, so we'll franchise tag you and offer you something less than that. But the bottom line is, if they are to franchise tag him, which they will do, I believe, unless they come to a long-term agreement before then, I believe the window was something like, I think they have like 2 weeks basically to kind of get, before they could tag him and he becomes a free agent. So the tag window is open. It's going to stay open. And if they do tag him, they'll have until like, I believe July 5th or something like that to get a long-term deal done with Pittman. But the number for the franchise tag is 21.8. And the reason why it's more significant than just the 1 year is that, to me, that's probably the starting point for, if you're the Colts, what long-term salary you want to kind of be around. You tell them, hey, well, the tag is this. We'll give you the tag times 4 or 5, probably 4, to keep you here. You get a huge payday. You hit free agency again by the time you're 30. You still got some, game left, a la Mike Evans. And so we'll see, but I think it's just a testament as far as the overall cap number going up to the health of the NFL. I know that the pandemic messed up a lot of projections and numbers and revenue for a lot of different leagues, but it seems like that is now firmly in the rear view after seeing, obviously a record-setting number come out. And as Pittman told us right before he, went on vacation, I assume, or right at the end of the season, he was like, anybody would be happy with $22 million a year. And so, I don't think he's like upset if he were to get tagged. However, it's certainly at least a concrete starting point. And I would like to know your thoughts, Jimmy, on would you tag him? Now, I know the tag thing gets everyone kind of freaked out, like, oh my gosh, they don't want to pay him. But it is a tool, as Chris Ballard said, to kind of negotiate further. So if you're, GM Jimmy Cook, what are your thoughts on possibly using that $21.8 million to then build on it?
There were only 2 reasons I would not place the tag on Michael, or there's only 2 reasons that the tag gets implicated with Michael Pittman Jr. Number one, if you feel like there's a negotiation going on between yourself, Pittman Jr., and his representation to the point that you feel comfortable about re-signing him. And maybe at that instance, you're using the tag somewhere else. I doubt this would happen, and it would be probably more expensive than maybe what they could get him for in negotiation, but the defensive tackle tag is $22 million, right around there. Be nice to bring Grover Stewart back, especially if it was only for 1 year.
Yeah.
It would be nice to have a proven commodity, suspension aside. Even though he's going to be 30, you're not locked into a long-term commitment with him. It's a 1-year effective cycle if you use the tag on him. Now, that said, the Colts, historically speaking, don't use the tag very often. So this might just be a one-and-done exclusive conversation of Michael Pittman Jr., and if they don't need to use the tag, they won't use it. The other reason, though, of why I would use it and why I likely would have tagged him when the window opened is you can't lose him. Under no circumstances can you lose into free agency. And all I view the tag is as a assertion that you are not letting him walk. Just because you tag him doesn't mean you can't then have a extension conversation, as you mentioned, between now and July. But heck, you could do it a week from now.
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be in July. You could do it whenever.
Yeah, for my mental health, get it done before then.
Right.
Because I don't want to be asking every day at training camp in Westfield, hey, did you get that deal done with your top player? Kind of like it was last year. Obviously, it's a lot different with the positions and stuff. But for my sake and selfishly, let's just have that resolved before I see them again.
Or more so after like rookie minicamp where there's that little lull where maybe James Boyd's able to take a little bit of a vacation, then all of a sudden notification comes through that the extension. I know you'll take the work where it comes, but still, I mean, make life a little bit easier.
Yeah,
I'm
not upset with that at all. Hey, I'll be in contact with certain people around the building. If you want to let me know what's going on, feel free. But to your point, Jimmy, I think that the reason they probably didn't tag him right away is because, I mean, I'm looking at Eddie right now. We were in school at one point. You never do anything before you have to.
Correct.
So I would say deadlines.
It's a last resort.
Exactly.
Right.
So they probably didn't tag him right away because
it's your get out of jail free card.
Yeah.
You know it's there, but you don't want to use it unless you really need to. I get it.
And I told Jimmy the other day, we were talking about this after the show, and I was like, if they use the tag like immediately or as soon as like the window opens and it's not before like the last day or two, that to me that's an alarm bell that these two sides are so far off that the Colts don't expect that they're going to be able to negotiate a contract before that deadline of the franchise tag and not the other way around.
And even if that isn't the case, the optics of it is exactly what you're talking about. Like, the optics don't look great if you tag them immediately out of the gate.
With what's happened with this franchise, though, whether they tag him out of the gate or at the 11th hour, alarm bells are still going to go off.
This is true.
How far apart are they? What's going on?
No, that's true. And look, I'll be real about this. If I'm Pittman, I want, whenever my contract comes through, assuming that he gets a long-term deal done here in Indianapolis, I want people to say, oh, that's too much money for him. Because then you got a good deal. That's just the reality of it. I think that we're going to view, maybe not us here in Indianapolis, but I do think that the national narrative will kind of be like Christian Kirk, I believe last year or the year before with the Jaguars, where it's like, why did you pay this guy this much money? It's because of his value relative to your team. And that's what I think changes the conversation for Michael Pittman Jr. Is he a top 5 wide receiver in the NFL? No. But he means so much to your team, especially at this juncture of this new era. Everyone is very high on Anthony Richardson. I'm one of them. I think that he could be the guy, but he is not. We don't know that yet from a health standpoint. And even just a play standpoint, he showed promise as a player, of course. But it was a 4-game sample size, very small sample size. So I know a lot of Colts fans have already crowned him. Oh, he's the second best, he's potentially the second best rookie in that class, or he's, arguably on the same level as CJ Stroud when they played in week 2 last year. He was the better player. Like, I get all of that. However, there's still going to be, to me, a gap between who he is now and the growth that he must kind of go through, and it won't always be linear. There's probably still some bad games he's going to have just because it's the NFL and it's hard. Everyone has bad games. So all that to say, to make his life easier, you don't let his top target walk for any reason. Like you said, Jimmy, the tag gives you relief, and believe me, even though they haven't used it yet, they will not be afraid to use it. Trust me on that. Like, just talking to people around the building, talking to Chris Ballard himself on the record, he said it is a tool. And they will use it. To me, I have written this sentence, and I feel like I plagiarize myself when I do it because I've written it so many times. It will be franchise malpractice to not franchise tag him, at least.
If it's required, right.
Exactly. There is no way I would even let him test the market.
Because he's gone.
Yeah.
If he gets out into the open market, it's over. I'm not saying that you can't still sell him on Anthony Richardson, but not only do you have teams that could potentially outbid you, you have maybe better situations that come off of top of that in terms of where the NFL is and how valuable wideouts are.
And I get that. And I'll say this real quick. There's people who are like, oh, he has his farm here. He would never leave here. He's invested so much into the community and his property. Brother, there are farms all over America.
But what about those animals, James?
I'm like, look, those chickens can
leave the animals.
Them chickens will be just fine.
Can't leave the
in
cows.
The truck. So,
the horse.
I mean, I'm just saying.
Send him to George Hill. He'll take care of him.
Exactly, which was a great story, by the way, by Mark Spears on ESPN. Check that out for sure. But all that to say, jokes aside, you franchise tag him if you have to. You negotiate. And, again, come summertime, we're not talking about, oh, what's happening with Pittman. We're talking about, oh, he's a part of your future.
We'll revisit this again deeper in the 2 o'clock hour, but we'll still have a little bit of time on the other side. So more on not just the franchise tag, but areas we'd like to see the Colts attack this offseason when we come back on Query & Company. 93.5, 107.5 The Fan.
March starts here. The
Likely this weekend in college hoops, another big one on the countdown to Selection Sunday and Conference Championship Week. Just 4 games left for a lot of teams in college basketball, 4 to 5, depending on where your conference schedule is in the countdown to Conference Tournament Week. Of course, just a little bit ago, we learned that salary cap number for the NFL will be $255.4 million. Was announced today.
Ooh-wee.
Some serious change across the board. 4 teams around the league. We also have final numbers now as they're completely finalized on what happens if you tag a player. Wide receiver is the biggest matter of importance in this town when it comes to that conversation. $21.8 million roughly. So what you're looking at for Michael Pittman Jr. if the Colts ultimately do end up tagging him. James, you had mentioned earlier, and you have a piece regarding this as well, of top objectives for the Colts this offseason. You brought up the Christian Kirk parallel to maybe what the Colts would give to Michael Pittman Jr. Where I want to see the Christian Kirk parallel from them, and I don't know if they're going to do it. I don't know if this is finally the year that Chris Ballard takes a big, legitimate swing in free agency. Because let's be clear, he'll spend money. He just usually does it on lesser top-tier players that he gets high value out of.
Yeah, B-list.
There's no doubt about that. Like, he finds B-list players and can turn into high-level A-minus guys at times. Like that, and that's useful. Fair. But I feel like for the development of Anthony Richardson, it's time to get an A-plus, at least from a signing standpoint, further weapon out there. And at this point, I don't really care who it is from the free agent wide receivers. I don't care if it's T. Higgins, who it seems like might be tagged. I'm fascinated to see what the Bengals do there, but there's more rumblings that they might tag him because Joe Burrow values him so much, and you get one more year of him in this first window, if you will, title window of the Joe Burrow era. So we'll see what happens there, but I don't care at this point if it's Hollywood Brown, if it's Mike Evans, if it's Calvin Ridley. I want another big, proven wide receiver, and not just necessarily big in size. I mean, yes, big name in this offense in the same way that while he wasn't a big name, the Jaguars overpaid for Kirk a couple years ago. They did everything they could to make life easier for Anthony Richardson. Just imagine if it's Michael Pittman Jr., Josh Downs, let's say Calvin Ridley, just to say a conversation, and not worry about like schematics and that aspect of it. Just the weapons around him. And then, oh, what's this? The 15th pick in the draft? Oh, it's Brock Bowers? Look at all the weapons that you've suddenly surrounded your rookie quarterback with. Am I crazy, or is there potentially an avenue where not only do they retain Michael Pittman Jr., tag or otherwise, but they also go out and they take a big splash at wideout when free agency opens in a couple weeks?
So, to your point on that, with the new cap numbers, the Colts are predicted to have $72 million, I believe, roughly, for free agency. And then obviously 22 of that will be going to Pittman on the tag if they were to tag him, and they would leave $50 million on the table to spend elsewhere. So they have money to spend. I would say in an ideal world, you're like, yeah, they paid whatever receiver to add to what they already have with Michael Pittman Jr., with Alec Pierce, with Josh Downs. But I don't know if I trust Chris Ballard to change that much in one offseason.
Do you think it's the right move to focus solely on wideout, or do you think they spread it out to other key needs?
I think it depends on the draft.
Sure.
It's kind of a cop-out answer, but...
No, you're right, though. That matters.
If you're able to get... Because they're saying this is supposed to be a deeper wide receiver draft. So even if you don't go wide receiver like with your first pick, which I would probably lean more towards a defensive back maybe with the number 15 pick. If it's not Brock Bowers, obviously, or Marvin Harrison Jr. slides to number 15. But I think that there is talent in this draft class that perhaps you can go there and get a cheaper upgrade for your wide receiver 3 or 4. But, I mean, I'm looking at some of the options here. Who do you think really fits? You got Mecole Hardman. You have Mike Evans, which is obviously a big-time name, big-time player still at his age of 30. Calvin Ridley, who I would imagine the Jacksonville Jaguars want to bring back.
Sure.
I wouldn't just let him walk out the door.
I think if he leaves, they have to trade Atlanta a second-round pick. I don't know. I think I saw something on that from like Ian Rappaport or something from that trade that they agreed upon when they brought him over.
Yeah.
If they lose him, that they owe them a second rounder?
Man, yeah, it's something. Yeah, it's very weird.
See, this is why I'm not a contract guy, because this stuff is too complicated for me. But all that to say, I'm like, who out here realistically would be your splash? Is it T. Higgins? Think they would go out there and try to play T. Higgins?
He's been the dream for a while, but
or pay Mike Evans? Like, I mean, these guys are expensive, and with Evans, at least, he's not a very young guy.
They would have to give Atlanta a second-round pick per Adam Schefter if he re-signs with Jacksonville.
Oh, okay. All right. So we'll see how that factors in. There's a lot to pick off the bones there, and I do want to get into that. We'll get into that towards the end of the show. Maybe we'll even have a conversation about that with our next guest, as Nick Baumgardner is going to join us, covers the NFL at large. We'll get his thoughts on all things free agency. I tell you what, though, the Marvin Harrison Jr. to 15 sounds an awful lot like Wemby to Indy all of a sudden, and that's an inside joke for those of us that have been around for the entire summer. We'll step aside. Conversation with Nick Baumgardner coming up next on Query and Company.
The Pacers are breaking all the
See, I feel like this is a song I used to play in Guitar Hero and be sweating in front of my TV trying to figure out if I got all the chords and notes right. So you're
going for that high score.
Exactly. Welcome back to the DriveHuler.com studio. I'm James Boyd alongside Jimmy Cook and Eddie Garrison. You're listening to 107.5 The Fan. Query and Company, Jake ditched us for the heat and fun of a U2 concert in Las Vegas. You know, all I know is he has jury duty next week, possibly. So be back from Vegas, by then, Mr. Query.
Leave your phone on.
Exactly. So obviously you all know, listeners out there, Indianapolis natives, the Combine is upon us. It's going to be here in a few days. I'll obviously be there. And we have one of my buddies, Nick Baumgardner from The Athletic, on the line. He is what I consider to be one of the draft gurus. He follows this stuff a lot more closely throughout the year than me. So, Nick, how you doing? And what are your thoughts on just getting to this point in the offseason where it feels like things are heating up a little bit?
Good, fellas. I hope you guys are well. I mean, I'm really glad that they didn't move the thing from Indy first and foremost. Like, we talk about this every year. I was just talking to this with Dane Brugler about this actually the other day. Like, if they ever move this thing away from Indy, I don't know what anyone's going to do because it's like the perfect city for all of this. So excited to get back and get rolling. I mean, got to get to St. Elmo's and some good steak going here this week for sure, or next week, I should say.
See, Nick has already got it mapped out. St. Elmo's first, football second.
You have to. You have to have a strategy of where you're going to attack, and I'm glad Nick is savvy enough to know St. Elmo's has to be on the list.
There you go. Exactly. So,
that's right.
Nick, obviously the Colts are not in the position they were last year where we all knew they have to draft a quarterback. They don't have any answers at quarterback. They have their guy who they believe can be a dude.
Right.
But at 15, where do you see them possibly going? And is Brock Bowers a legitimate potential pick for them, considering how his value might oscillate between now and obviously the draft?
I mean, if he falls to them, yeah. I mean, if he falls to them, that's got. I mean, and that's real. That's realistic. I mean, the way that the board is so quarterback dependent this year because so many teams need one. The Colts jumped the line on that one. Maybe that'll turn out to be smart on them, but they don't have to worry about it this year. There's going to be some teams that have to reach and go a little higher than maybe you would want, and that's why the buzz on, J.J. McCarthy right now, for instance, is got him pushed all the way up to the top 10 or at least inside the top 15, which I think is pretty legitimate because while he's not a top 15 player, certainly not a top 10 player, he's the next in line at quarterback and he's a worthy first-round pick, and some teams just have no choice. So, yeah, tight end tends to slip anyway in most years. Bowers, I think, is a little different, though. I mean, he is, there's going to be teams that have him certainly top 5 on their board overall in the entire class, regardless of position. I mean, he's that good of a player. I could see him going to the Chargers up there at 5 or 6, whatever they're at. But, yeah, I mean, he could totally fall. And if he fell to Indy, that's it, because Indy has needs, of course, but they could do a few different things. There's not anything they sort of have to do. But I think that would be an awesome fit if he were able to fall down there and give them another anchor on offense to build around.
Nick Baumgardner is our guest, senior writer at The Athletic, and does great coverage among all things NFL, but especially around this time of year with the NFL draft. Nick, I've made it clear on this show a number of times, I'm an offensive first guy. I think a lot of people are. Like, we love the high flair of high-powered offenses and big game-wrecking plays, and especially here in Indy when you have a young quarterback, assuming they bring back Michael Pittman Jr., it's nice to dream about the idea of them, whether it's in free agency or in the draft, getting another weapon like a Brock Bowers or like this wide receiver-rich class. But let's say they don't do that. And my initial reaction is usually like, all right, they're going with somebody on the defensive side of the ball. In the range for them, why should Colts fans, if they are like me, they're offense first-minded, why should they still be excited if they go, let's say, cornerback or an edge rusher? And if it's the latter, a spot that the Colts have kind of been seeking that next great edge rusher for this franchise?
That's a great question because I think that those are two spots in particular, especially corner and really edge too, but really I think corner where you could end up, if you're the Colts, you could end up with the top corner on the board. I just did my 3-round mock a couple weeks ago, and I have Terry Arnold, Alabama's corner there, as my top corner. And I think he's a top 10 player, but I had him down there at the Colts because, I mean, there was nobody, I couldn't get the corner thing started and too many teams needed other stuff. And it was just one of those things that he got pushed down. And, we're talking about a top 10 player that falls to you, and no question about it. I think he's a starter right away. A guy can come in and help your defense. A guy can come in and help others around him improve. And I think that's the type of thing that if you're sitting in the middle of the draft like this, when there's so many teams that need a quarterback, that's what you're really hoping for. Like Jared Verse would be another one if he were able to fall, and I think he could. The Florida State edge there, who's really freaky. You mentioned Leitu Latu as another one there in that range, but Verse is another one that's, in any other year, we're talking about him as a top 12, no question about it. But, with the quarterbacks the way they are, I don't know. Maybe somebody slides or falls. And the same thing could happen to these receivers. I don't think that's a slam dunk. I don't think it'll happen. But, if somebody slides and falls, who's to say? I mean, it's not impossible.
How much easier does it make life for the Colts if they decide to go defense? And let's say solely in the cornerback room when they feel like they already have a great piece having potentially hit a home run with Juju Brents where they took him last year.
Yes. I mean, I think that if you do that and you get a guy like Arnold or even Quinyon Mitchell that falls to you there, I think both those guys would be certainly worthy of that spot where the Colts are at. I think that it allows you to do other things beyond that when you start to go, into the second round beyond. You mentioned receiver earlier, and obviously Pittman's part of the conversation. But I gave him Jalen Polk, the kid from Washington. I mean, there's so many good receivers that are going to be there in the second round that are going to be starters. Troy Franklin, Xavier Worthy. We mentioned Polk, Malachi Corley, the kid from Western Kentucky. There's so many good players that would be able to come in and be quarterback-friendly receivers. Roman Wilson's another one that would be, a best friend type for an Anthony Richardson, a guy that is always open, is always on time, doesn't drop passes. And those are the players I feel like the Colts need to surround him with. And there's a lot of guys in that second round area there. I wouldn't do it with their first round pick. I think it's a little too high. But if you get the rest of that stuff off the board, if you get like a starter on defense that just falls to you, it allows you to do so many different things, the rest of the day.
So, Nick, to pivot a little bit away from the Colts to the Lions, which is the team that you really focus on throughout the season, obviously we saw what they were able to do last year, what they built. And I thought one of the interesting questions that was asked to Daniel Jeremiah of NFL Network yesterday was, could they be the blueprint for other teams, as far as taking a player versus is the positional value where it needs to be, or modern NFL, is it worth to take a running back this high, all those things. What do you think of their need perhaps to kind of tweak some things to get right back there? Because I thought what Dan Campbell said after they lost to the 49ers was real. Like, this might have been our one shot. However, they have some pieces still there to get back there. Obviously, it's going to be harder. Things change. It's football. People get hurt, all those things. But what about them kind of gives you a little bit of I don't know, I want to say hope is the right word, but just the idea that, okay, it is realistic for them to make this a sustained window for a Detroit City that was kind of starving for this.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important part, is that it can be a sustained window, and I think that's real. I think that is very real, and he's right about, you get that far and you never know, right? You never know if you're no matter how good you are, you just don't know how that's going to go. But I do think that if you look at their roster, they have so many good. Their best players are all on rookie contracts. Except for Goff, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Penei Sewell, Aiden Hutchinson, Laporta, Gibbs. Now adds into the fray. Lee McNeil's another one. They just have done such a great job with their top, I would say, like 4 picks of the last 3 or 4 years. Really last 3, Brad Holmes' drafts. And they just haven't missed, on really hardly any. And when you build your team, through the draft, and Colts fans know this too. I mean, Ballard's whole thing got a little obviously off kilter, but that was the whole idea there too to begin with, is build the team through the draft, have a good foundation, and then try to extend that window as long as you can around a quarterback. And I think that, they like where Goff's at. I'm very curious to see what that contract's going to look like. I would assume there'll be an extension for him. I don't know what it'll be. But I do think they have a little bit more of a window than maybe people might have realized, because, they're one of the youngest teams in the league. And I think that is a blueprint in that it's just about drafting the best possible player you can that fits your locker room. And if the guy doesn't fit your locker room, then don't do it. And I think that that's pretty much the simple principle they tend to use, and it's worked out pretty well so far.
Nick Baumgardner of The Athletic taking some time with us here on Query and Company. Nick, a year ago, Dalton Kincaid, Michael Mayer, Sam Laporta, to name a few, headlined what was a pretty strong, especially towards the top, tight end class. There's a couple teams. Cincinnati was linked towards a tight end potentially last year. Kansas City is going to be preparing for life after Travis Kelce, and here locally not like that he's going to retire, but you know what I mean, building towards who the next tight end is in that system. And for the Colts, I feel like with what Shane Steichen wants to do, they have a lot of good tight ends that don't do a ton great, but they do a lot of things well. And maybe a tight end like Brock Bowers this year is a piece that is perfect for a Shane Steichen-led offense. If they don't take him, I mentioned the prospects a year ago, it seemed like there were multiple avenues you could go down. Is there that same level of high-end depth at the position this year when it comes to tight end?
No, it's not nearly as good. Last year's was darn near generational in terms of the number of guys that you had in the top 100. That was a bit of a reach, or a bit newer, I should say. But this isn't bad. This is maybe 1B. I mean, close to. I think the position in general, if you really follow college football, is getting deeper as college teams start to understand what to do with tight ends more. They're starting to let them, block more and have more responsibility in that, and not just ask them to be big, long receivers that go out there and stand around. So there are more guys, even into the third round, I think this year that you can find a starter. Theo Johnson's a kid from Penn State that had a really nice Senior Bowl. Kate Stover from Ohio State. And the other really good one beyond Bowers, Jatavian Sanders, a kid from Texas, who's really, really athletic and could do a lot of things. Jaheim Bell from Florida is another one like this. So there's a lot more NFL-ready tight ends, I should say, coming out in the last maybe 3 or 4 years than we saw in the previous handful, because I think the position has changed and developed into more of a, are you looking for an inline guy? Are you looking for a flex guy? Are you looking for a guy that can do both? And I think that a lot of college teams are starting to understand what pro teams are looking for. And so you got guys that are sort of properly compartmentalized, and they know what they're doing, and they know what's asked of them. So I think that it's better than it's been, but it's not as good as what it was last year. Last year was really, really good. One of the best we've seen in a long time.
So I can't have you come on the show, be a draft guru / analyst, and not ask about Justin Fields and the Chicago Bears and Caleb Williams. And if you put your GM hat on, Nick, right now, which way are you leaning? And more realistically, what makes this decision so unique, perhaps, than other quarterback decisions? Because obviously, I would say usually every year it's like, oh, do you trade up to get a guy, or do you just draft this guy? But like, they have a guy who could be really good, and then they have a guy who could be really good who might be a lot cheaper as well. So, or which way are you leaning, and how do you see that kind of playing out?
Well, I think the uniqueness of it is that you've got a guy who is so talented, and everybody knows it, and you as the franchise have failed him. And I think that's the situation. He's getting to the end of his deal here now, and you failed him. You're really not any closer to competing than you were when you started, and when you take a guy like that, you have to be ready. The Bears, when they took Fields, really when the Bears took him and the Lions didn't, like that was the great test case scenario for a lot of teams that they should copy that, yes, because the Lions were not ready for a quarterback then. If they'd have taken Justin Fields back in 2021, it would have been the same thing. It would have been a mess. And they would be in the same situation right now as the Bears are in. So, I think it's a unique situation from that standpoint, that you're going to have to probably maybe move on from a guy that you really hate to do that, because he's got so much ahead of him still. And that's sort of indicative of how, football is these days. These quarterbacks need more time when they come out. But not all of them do. And I think that when you see a guy like Caleb Williams sitting there and you have another pick in the top 10, you have a chance to add, Caleb Williams and maybe a top receiver with him. I mean, that's like franchise changing, I think. And I think that that's something that you just can't, ignore or turn down, no matter how much, you like how Justin Fields improved last year. And I think he did, improve quite a bit. But like, if you don't do that and Caleb Williams goes somewhere else and you have to sit there and watch that, and Fields doesn't turn into basically a Pro Bowler next year, you're regretting it, right? Like, so I think that that's the line you're walking. And I would assume that, Fields is traded and, the Bears take Caleb or, Drake May or whoever it is there at the top. I would assume it's Caleb, and they move on from there. But it's such a tough spot because they're in this position. They made that great trade with Carolina, but like if they hadn't done that, it would be just a total mess. So it's weird for sure, but I think it's something where they're going to have to do something here soon, because there'll be enough suitors for Fields. There's enough suitors. He's a talented kid. There'll be enough out there for him.
Yeah, Athletics' Nick Baumgardner is our guest, covers the NFL at large as well as the NFL draft. Nick, wide receiver in this draft, we know it's, at least on paper, appears to be deep, and there's going to be opportunities to be able to select one that could maybe not fully change the fortune of a franchise right away, depending on where you're picking, but could definitely help speed up offensive development. Kind of a two-angled question here. I don't think the Colts are doing this, but just to, stir the pot a little bit for the Colts fans and then get realistic with it. What are the chances a team moves up for Marvin Harrison Jr. in this draft? I know that's the hardest part of mocking, but what are the chances something like that happens? And then smaller scale, maybe more realistically, is it worth it for a team, not for Marvin Harrison Jr., maybe somebody in the 10 to 15 range like the Colts are, to trade up to get one of the top shelf wideouts in this deep class?
I do think that that's possible, and I think not just for Marvin there. I think Malik Neighbors and maybe even Odunze, Rome Odunze, the kid from Washington. We've talked about this a little bit, Dane, internally. The line between, and Harrison is number one, and my board, Harrison on some people's boards is going to be number one player in the draft. But the line between Harrison and Neighbors is not as wide as people probably think, and I think that speaks more about how good Neighbors is as a legit top 5 pick or a legit top 5 prospect. And I think some people are also going to have Rome Odunze up there at maybe 5 or 6. And I think back to a couple years ago when, some teams moved up and we saw Devonta Smith, the Eagles move up to get him. This feels familiar to that class a little bit, in that you've got 3 guys at the top who I do think are possible, game changers who can come in right away and help whoever is throwing to them, make them look a lot better. You know what I mean? I think beyond that, it gets a little trickier, and you got guys that are going to help offensive development, like you said, guys that are going to come in and help an offense get a lot better and help a situation. But those 3 at the top are really, really good. And I could definitely see, somebody down there who's got the assets to do it say, hey, we got a situation here where we like everything, but we need to be a little bit more explosive. Let's go get one of these guys because they can change everything. And they're cheap, like I said. It's rookie deals. So I can see that happening for sure. I think that's absolutely a possibility.
Nick, I kind of want to take a step, I guess, back big picture wise, and I got a kick out of this when I was looking at some people like, do you go the Patrick Mahomes route and do you just draft a bunch of guys and get guys on 1-year deals to build around your quarterback? And I'm like, well, that's not your quarterback, So,
right.
How have you seen maybe the wide receiver market, not market, but the draft itself shift over the last few years, where it seems like you can get a number 1 guy ready to go from day one, as opposed to maybe, 15, 20 years ago. How have you seen that kind of shift with just the way offenses have been built in the NCAA until now, where you can have a Jamar Chase come in and be your number 1 right away? You can have Marvin Harrison Jr. potentially be your number 1 right away, and others we've seen throughout recent years.
Yeah, I love this conversation because it's changed right before our eyes, and it's happened in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's something that everybody saw coming, and we knew it was happening. And I'm not sure that the receivers playing today quite understand it, right? Some of the money they ask for, because I always say all the time, I'm like, you guys aren't getting that money anymore, because there's every year. It's not just this year. It's not just last year. It'll be next year and the year after that. The way that teams started to move away from, the spread and shred with the power spread stuff and now we're going to spread out and throw the ball. So now, you're finding players, you're better athletes at a younger age, and you're having them play receiver. And it used to be, in the 90s, 2000s, and in the early 2010s or even, it would take a while for a college receiver to truly understand everything that needs to happen, and it would be a process. And that's just not the case at all anymore. You see guys walk in the door as freshmen and are just absolutely outstanding, and that's where the best athletes tend to go. I always joke about it. You go to a recruiting camp anywhere in the country, a top 100 camp or whatever, and the line at receiver is 5 times as long as the line at corner. And it's like the coaches will always joke about everybody gets paid, you know what I mean? Like they need corners, the same thing, but the best athletes want to play receiver, and that's how it's been, I feel like, for quite a while. And the way that offenses go today, you're 100% right. You don't need to overspend or do anything crazy. You can consistently find and replenish yourself at that position if you're smart about it in the draft. And most teams, I think you should be taking one every year in this stretch, because there's so many good ones every year that come out that you'd be almost doing yourself a disservice if you didn't look at it.
Nick Baumgardner of The Athletic taking some time with us. Nick, I want you to put on your GM hat as you cover all things NFL, and I know the draft is your wheelhouse around this time of year, but it's pertinent to the Colts because there's a lot of moving parts with free agency and then the draft right around the corner after that. So if you put on a GM hat and you look at the Colts, they have the luxury of, as you mentioned, having jumped the line. At least they think they did. They have their quarterback, and he's on that rookie pay scale. And philosophically, people will vary based on how aggressive do you get and where do you get the most aggressive from a spending standpoint while you have the rookie quarterback to maximize your window. In the Colts case, it's a de facto rookie season, so you're also taking into account the fact that you want to make life as easy on him as possible. For the Colts, let's say they keep Michael Pittman Jr., whether it's a tag or a contract. Let's say they get it done and it's not a massive cap hit to where they still have money to spend. When you look at this draft and look at this crop of free agents at wideout, where are the Colts better served to benefit Anthony Richardson? And maybe they do both, but where are they better served? Take a big swing in free agency along with Michael Pittman Jr.'s retention, or hit as many homers as you can in the draft at wideout?
I would do it in the draft. I would 100% do it in the draft, especially like we talked about earlier, what, the offense they run with what Steichen does. The guys that are coming out now, they don't need time to adjust. They understand what's going on. They understand what's being asked of them. I think that coaches and just the system, it's been forced because of the way the game has changed. But the position, they're just ready. They're more ready to go. And, I like Josh Downs a lot too, but you could use another one. You need more reliable people around a young quarterback like that. That's why, and C.J. Stroud was terrific by himself, obviously, right? But if you look at the people that are around him and you look at the players he was able to throw to this year, it helps an awful lot to have, talent like that he's thrown to. I mean, it helps to have reliable people, and they did a good job of working trust and all that sort of thing too. But guys you can trust, a lot of times with quarterbacks, a guy your own age, a guy that's closer in age to you, a guy that you can understand and hang out with, because that's a lot of it. A guy that you're going to spend time with and say, okay, all hell's breaking loose on this read. I need to find somebody. Where's my guy? You need to find as many of those guys as possible to put around him, and I think that you do that in the draft. And I mean, I think that you still do your due diligence and free agency and everything else, and obviously you work what you got to do with Pittman, but you got to continue to sort of find guys in the draft that are going to help your quarterback along the way as you develop them.
Well, look, man, I really appreciate you coming on the show, Nick. I will see you in a few days here in Indianapolis. Take care, my friend, and thanks for coming on.
All right, guys, take care.
Again, that was Nick Baumgardner. My coworker at The Athletic does a lot more work than me around this time of the year because he is deep into film study, the Senior Bowl, the, East-West Shrine Bowl, all these different things to get us prepared for mock draft season, which is what we're in right now. And I thought he made a very good point, Jimmy, to emphasize that they have to build this thing through the draft. And I think that's just the nature of what Chris Ballard has always done. And I also think it's what they kind of have to do given the options that they have. Even though they have a lot of cap space, I don't see them going out there paying Pittman and then also paying another receiver. They probably got to find a pass catcher, whether it's Brock Bowers or a receiver or someone else in the draft. And I'd be okay with that because, as Nick alluded to, there's a lot of talent in this draft. And as I told Eddie off air, I kind of believe Shane Steichen can turn players or make them a little bit better than maybe they are because of the scheme stuff that he's able to do with them.
And by that same logic, though, I would like to see it happen. If they're going to do that, and they're going to do it in the draft at wideout, I would like to see it happen in the first round. I would like to see them go
That's fair.
With a position player, whether it's trading up, whether it's Brock Bowers, but the idea of them having that opportunity in front of them and then instead of taking it in the draft,
trading back,
or if it's an edge rusher or a cornerback, I'm sure it'll fit well in a Gus Bradley system, but I would rather it happen offensively and assist him as much as possible. But that's the beauty of mock draft season. We have plenty of time to discuss that. We're going to step aside. When we come back, we will shift back to the Pacers. Nice win for the Pacers last night over the Detroit Pistons. Still have a couple games left in this homestand. Caitlin Cooper of Basketball She Wrote covers the Pacers regularly. Will join us to give her perspective on where they're at post All-Star break when we return on Query & Company.
The IRS is the most powerful collector.
I guess it's possible. You put Caitlin Cooper and Sabrina against Steph and Damian Lillard in the Bay Area for All-Star Weekend. Everybody's going to want to watch that because of how Sabrina performed and how great we know Caitlin Cooper is.
That was one of the funniest clips from the past weekend. You're listening to Query and Company. I'm James Boyd, alongside Jimmy Cook, Eddie Garrison. Jake is out, but we have Caitlin Cooper on the line, and I believe the last name is Cooper, not Clark. She can explain it, but she covers the Pacers for Basketball She Wrote, has her own, media platform. I encourage you all to support a Patreon, all those things. Buy some shirts, buy some merch. Caitlin, how are you doing, and what was your reaction to, I guess, being included in the best shooter ever conversation?
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm very surprised. I regret to inform everybody that I won't be entering into the WNBA next year, and I'm probably not going to be available to compete next to Sabrina against Steph and Dame at the All-Star competition. A lot of people have been mixing up our names, so I will give Chris Mannix a bit of a break there. He did say that he had been reading the article that was written about me at Indy Monthly, and that was in the back of his head when he went on there to do that particular video spot, and then he ended up saying my name multiple times, so I feel bad about that. But I guess it's a much bigger compliment for me to get mixed up with her than it is for her to get mixed up as me, so we'll go with it.
You know what? You're too modest. I'm like, you got one goat getting mixed up with another goat.
Exactly.
But speaking of, obviously, the team you cover, the Pacers, got a win last night. There were some shaky moments in that third quarter where I thought defense looked optional, which tends to be the case sometimes with the Pacers. But what did you think of their, I guess, response to coming out of the All-Star break and obviously getting a win when it could have been looked at as a trap game?
Yeah, I think that it was kind of a microcosm of what we're going to be looking at over the last 25 games, right? Because three important trends. Tyrese Halliburton and his health, what does he look like? The ongoing and building chemistry between him and Pascal Siakam, the more that they get reps together out there on the floor and what that looked like at the end of the fourth quarter. And then also, as you just mentioned, the defense. They gave up more points in the third quarter than they gave up in the entire first half. And I think there's probably a lot that you can break down with that. I think in the first half, some of that, I have a lot of questions for the Detroit Pistons. They ended up playing an 11-man rotation 13 minutes into that game. They're all bench unit. When Cade and Jaden Ivey came out of that game with about 4 minutes and 30 seconds left in the first quarter, the Pistons were only down 6 points, 24-18. By the time that quarter was over, they were down 42-25. So get outscored 18-7 by pretty much the Pacers' second unit. It's a little bit questionable for me that a rebuilding team that has less than 10 wins this year is playing an all-bench unit, let alone an all-bench unit with players from other teams who got traded there who weren't on those other teams' rotation. So, Cade and Jaden barely end up playing 30 minutes last night. Benedict Mathurin played 35 as a starter, and his team was up by 30 points at one point in that game. Also, Detroit, pretty shaky with a lot of the turnovers. They had a stretch at the end of the second quarter with, 3 turnovers in a row that the Pacers were able to capitalize on. They took a lot better care of the ball in the third quarter. And as you said, defense a little bit optional for the Pacers. I know that Rick Carlisle mentioned after the game that he did something he doesn't normally do, which is to have them stay there and watch film of that third quarter and see some of, what the breakdowns were, because they got beat on the same empty side double drag play a couple times on lob guys getting behind them. Obviously some kind of sloppy outlet passes where even Tyrese throws one off of Miles' back that ends up turning into a pick six. So just some stuff to clean up there. But I think that that game really did speak to what we're going to be looking at for the Pacers headed into hopefully what will become a playoff berth for them.
Caitlin Cooper is our guest, covers the Pacers for Basketball She Wrote. Caitlin, last night, Benedict Mathurin gets the start. How do you evaluate his performance and how he is meshed in with the different lineup combinations that exist for the Pacers in the Pascal Siakam world in the last couple weeks?
I was actually a little bit surprised that they did look at Ben, to be honest with you, because I think that in a lot of ways he's been really successful as a bench player because he and TJ McConnell mesh really well with one another. TJ is somebody who, a little bit differently than Andrew Nembhard and Tyrese Halliburton, TJ likes to attack baseline, and he typically will get 2 feet in the paint. It's incredibly hard to keep him out of the lane. That really kind of unlocks Benedict Mathurin as a cutter. TJ looks for Benedict as in transition. There's some set actions that bench unit runs that the starters don't really run that suit Ben pretty well. So I actually thought it was a possibility that they might end up looking at Ben Shepherd and just putting him into that starting lineup in place of Aaron Nesmith because that lineup minus what Aaron does as a shooter, is a little bit more of a defensive bent. So I thought maybe they would look at Ben. But as far as actually Benedict Mathern in that game, probably not the most efficient outing for him, going 5 of 14, 1 of 3 from 3. He did have some pretty decent passes. I felt like there were some times, particularly in that third quarter, one thing that I still want to see him work on is he caught a pass in the left corner that was an extra swing pass from Siakam, had plenty of time to shoot and ended up kind of being a little bit hesitant, put the ball on the floor, and then tried to split between 2 defenders to finish on the left side of the rim. That ends up being a very fast breakable miss that Cade Cunningham turned into a pull-up 3 the other way. I think a lot of times with him, he's so good at playing out a triple threat and what he does with his jab step, but he can rely on a little too much when he could be taking the inflow shots that come to him, and then that will make the defense respect him a little bit more. So I think, too, headed into the All-Star break, I know that they had mentioned that, health-wise, he had been dealing with some things, and they didn't think he looked quite right, which is why he sat out that game against Toronto. So I'm sure he's probably still working his way back into things. But I think overall, I generally like, for the rest of this season at least, what his fit is with the second unit, because his usage shifts quite a bit when he plays with Tyrese, and when he doesn't. So I think his usage goes up by about 5% when he doesn't play with Tyrese, and that kind of allows him to establish himself a little bit more as a scorer and play with those bench units that are now kind of being joined with Pascal as a little bit of a through line as well.
When I look at what they've been building the last couple of seasons, and I think a lot of people view it the same way the Pacers most certainly do with where they drafted Benedict, they hope that his final form and his growth and development is a starter instead of being he's valuable. Because you're right. I think a lot of people view him right now as he is so valuable with that second unit, what he brings to the table, and players in front of him when you have Aaron Nesmith getting those minutes in the starter role instead. He fits great there, but ultimately he should ascend at one point in time, if they're on the right trajectory internally, to a starting role. I think you kind of answered it there at the end of your observations from him, but is that type of fit possible for him by the end of this season? In the final 25 games, how big of a surprise for you would it be if he has developed enough to be a better fit as a starter for this team come postseason versus being that first man off the bench?
I almost think that some of that has to do with the other players on the roster. Because in order for him to start, that would mean that you're taking Andrew Nembhard out of the starting lineup and what the trickle-down effects of that are. So if Aaron Nesmith continues to start at the 3 spot and you were to remove Andrew Nembhard, that's going to put Aaron Nesmith back in the position to have to defend a lot at the point of attack. And there was a 2-game stretch where he fouled out trying to defend against Jalen Brunson, and then he fouled out again in the next game trying to defend point guard. So at that point, they put Andrew Nembhard in. That allows him to do that role, allows Aaron to defend more naturally at his more natural position against wings. And then also it keeps TJ McConnell in the rotation. And I think it seems pretty clear to me that Rick really values having him off the bench and what he provides as a spark plug. And that was even evident last night in that initial run that they went on and what TJ brought. And if you end up moving Andrew Nembhard back to the bench, that gets a little bit trickier, I feel. And I just think for the rest of the season, it more just has to do with what the overall fit is. I do agree with you that you're hoping that when you take Benedict Mathern at number 6 in the draft, that he does become a starter. And I still think that there's place and time for that. I don't think it necessarily has to get contentious between he and Nembhard at this given point in time. I just think, and numbers-wise, it reflects better in terms of how many points per 100 possessions they're outscoring people by when Nembhard's out there versus Mather. And I think right now to fit with Tyrese, you either need to be somebody who's a really good knockdown shooter and can space around the ball and shape up around the ball, relocate in the flow game that the Pacers play, or be somebody who's going to be protective of Tyrese on defense and be able to take on those 2 assignments, which I think is why they've kind of floated back and forth between Buddy and Nembhard before they ultimately ended up deciding to move on from Buddy at the trade deadline.
Caitlin, I want to pivot back to Tyrese, who sort of had a deja vu moment last night where he made a bunch of threes at Gainbridge Fieldhouse. We saw that in the All-Star game, but obviously this game means a bit more for their standings for their season. And afterward, he said he feels fully healthy. Your reaction to that and what that could mean, because obviously we know the leap he's taken this season and the level he can play at when he does feel like himself.
Yeah, I don't know that he still looks by my eye to be completely 100%. I think he mentioned after the fact that he was tired from having played more minutes than what he's been used to be doing. And I think that showed up at times where you could see him on defense kind of leaning over, holding his shorts, at times where it looked like he needed to still get back up to that amount of game shape. But something that he mentioned that I do think has shown up quite a bit in the past 8 games before this is he said he got to his one dribble three going to his right. And Tyrese is a little bit quirky because a lot of times right-handed shooters will typically step back or escape dribble to their left, but he's somebody who readily does that to their right. But over the last 8 games, we really haven't been seeing him do that. He hasn't taken that many one dribble threes, period. Like a total of 8. Last night he took 2, and he was creating quite a bit of separation. And why that matters is going to launch off of his left leg, which is the hamstring that he injured. So to see him actually get to that twice, in addition to the 2 dunks, one being a reverse dunk, that's better than he's looked during the stretch when he came back the one game against Portland and then when he came back again the second time. I think that's an important stride for him because he is so – when he goes against switches, he's very dependent more so on creating separation with his shot than he is with what he always drives back to for natural and footwork pass. On that was a good sign, what we should expect us.
So what you're saying is Tyrese is going to be the dunk contest next year after the reverse dunk. You heard it here first, folks. Caitlin Cooper.
You get a boost in the dunk contest from scoring, from what I could tell, if you are an all-star. Like, you get padded a couple extra points just from that.
You mean jumping over a chair isn't significant enough? Someone seated, it's 5'5". That doesn't deserve more points? Is that what you're talking about?
If you put on a glove, you should automatically get at least 2 extra points.
Well, the last thing I'll ask you on my end when it comes to the Pacers is, when you look at the structure of this team, do you think now is the time to sort of evaluate them because they have their pieces? Obviously, Aaron Nesmith, unfortunate he's out, but, I mean, how much longer do we look at them and say, oh, they got to play more games together before you can say this is who they are and who they'll be come postseason, play-in, playoff time?
I think right now some of the stuff with Pascal and Terry needs to be given time because one moment right before the All-Star break in that game against Toronto when Pascal scored that basket at the rim, I believe was their go-ahead shot, was significant for me because prior to that, Tyrese had only set a total of 7 screens for Pascal Siakam.
Caitlin, I apologize. We heard what you're saying there, but it might be on our end. It might be on your end. The connection has started to fade in and out there, and the content is great, but we're so close to break that we don't have enough time to give you a call back. So at minimum, we want to give the shout-out where we can. Find all of our work on our Patreon. Basketball She Wrote does a great job covering the Pacers, and Caitlin, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Hey, thanks, guys.
That is Caitlin Cooper, and that is the way that radio works sometimes because as we all chuckle to ourselves right there at the end, connection's back, but just think that's the name of the game sometimes, James.
That's life, man. Radio is hard, but definitely a shout out to Caitlin for coming on and really all of our guests today because that was fun.
We're going to step aside. When we come back, we'll have final thoughts on a monster weekend in college hoops. We'll, of course, have some bets for you as well. And maybe pen James' mind one more time in the lead up to Combine Week next week, the next step in the Colts offseason, a critical offseason for them with a de facto rookie season coming up for Anthony Richardson. Bets, college hoops, combine analysis up next to close out a great week on Query & Company on The Fan.
At Indiana Farm Bureau Insurance,
Plays of the day.
This is me, all right? I'm not an athlete. This is my way. This is how I win.
Today's plays of the day, looking ahead to the weekend. Some action today and then some future bets for a good weekend slate. First for tonight, we'll take the Minnesota Timberwolves on the money line. They welcome in the Milwaukee Bucks. Also today, little Ivy League action. We'll take Cornell to win on the money line over Yale as the race for Ivy League seeding heats up with their conference tournaments in the coming weeks. This is going to be a bet that I think we make throughout the year, and we'll see where we're at. We're 0 for 1 to this point, so down about a unit for this selection. Lionel Messi will find the back of the net on Sunday when Inter Miami, takes on LA Galaxy. He's plus 100 right now as an anytime goal scorer. There's no odds out yet for Purdue or Butler. I'll lay whatever the points are for Purdue, and I'm going to take Butler to win on the money line. I assume they'll be plus money on the road against Seton Hall. Eddie, do you have anything this weekend?
I do not.
Nothing from the slate
From
for
a
you?
betting perspective, I do not.
All right. Well, at minimum, you can find Eddie's coverage as lead producer of Pacers basketball as the Pacers are back in action on Sunday. That'll be right here on these very
Luka
airwaves.
Doncic, and that would happen to be Carlisle's former superstar. So
there you go. Well, little Dallas Mavericks trip coming into town. Additionally, this weekend on The Fan, Soccer Saturdays, Greg Rakestraw at 9 to 10 a.m. tomorrow, as well as Pacers Weekly with Pat Boylan, of course, from 10 to 11. And it's a monster weekend for high school hoops, especially in girls basketball. It's the state finals, class 1 through 4A, right here on these very airwaves. Gets started in the morning all the way up until the evening slate. So 1, 2, 3, and 4A. Going to be a great time for high school hoops. If you don't have the opportunity to get to Gamebridge, heck, even if you do, be sure to be locked in here on The Fan for another great state finals in girls basketball. James, we've still got a little bit of time left, and we mentioned it earlier in the show, but for those that are just joining us, James, of course, beat writer for the Colts. Among other work, you see him moonlighting as a Pacers beat writer at times too, whenever they ask over at The Athletic. But busy week for all of us, but especially on your end at the Combine. Where do things stand in terms of your checklist on the Colts beat in this next step of the offseason?
Obviously, the Pittman stuff will work itself out. That's not priority number one, I would say, during the Combine week. However, I'm curious to see what Chris Ballard has to say Wednesday about the draft and his approach to it, and also just the offseason as a whole, because we haven't had a chance to really talk to him about that. We talked to him a little bit at the end of the season, but that was more of like recapping what happened, immediate things like Anthony Richardson's health, all those things. Obviously, we'll get an update on Anthony Richardson, which will be huge to get from Chris Ballard if he provides one. We saw the video of him throwing. But then beyond that, I know he will be coy with a lot of his answers, but then it's kind of parsing through that, reading through the tea leaves to see what could possibly change for this offseason to kind of change the results he's had in Indianapolis, because we know this is a guy who I believe is going into his 8th year in Indy, hasn't won a division title, was one game within that last season. And so the expectation, I think realistic expectations are to go out there and win the division next year. So excited to hear from him. Also excited to hear from Shane Steichen, because obviously he'll have a huge role in the decision-making of the team. But beyond that, for me, it's just looking at the players who are in the positions of need and kind of evaluating for myself who could possibly be a good fit. So I'll spend a lot of time talking to the DBs, the cornerbacks, the edge rushers. Those are the 3 main positions, I would say. And also, pass catchers, wide receivers, things like that. So I'm excited to get out there, get busy, but I guess it's probably less stressful in a sense, because there's so many directions they could go in, and there's just not as much tension.
It's way different than a year ago.
Yeah, last year it was like, okay, I got to make sure I get to not only the podium where this quarterback is talking, but it's to get there very quickly, because there's going to be 50 people asking questions as well. So a little less fanfare with DBs, cornerbacks, edge rushers, wide receivers, but a lot to obviously get accomplished this week.
And it's just an easier frame of mind knowing that they have so many different paths. But as Nick Baumgardner, who joined us earlier in the podcast, will be up, just search Query & Company. Wherever you get your podcast, he covers the NFL draft and the NFL for The Athletic. They feel like they have that answer at quarterback. And so it opens doors and removes some of the tension, as you highlighted, from a year ago that would have been present knowing that you feel like you have the quarterback and you can build around him. James, it's always great to have you in studio, my friend. I know that there's a close bond between the three of us, having you in here throughout the summer last year, and always good when you're here. I know this is the second show of the week for you, but as you joked about, back in your usual time slot, great to have you back in. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, appreciate you having me. Obviously, I'm envious of Jake being out in Las Vegas right now, but always fun to come on, talk indie sports, and I really felt like this has become my home after the All-Star game. I was like, man, this is really cool. We're going right from this to the Combine. I was even getting offended when people were talking about the city and all that stuff. So I'm excited for what's to come.
Well, we're glad to have you a part of the Indy family, and always good, as I mentioned, to have you back in studio. No doubt our paths will once again cross on these very airways sometime soon, whether it's as an interviewee or whether it's right back in the co-host chair. Always appreciate James Boyd. You can subscribe to The Athletic, get all of his work there, and follow him on Twitter at Romeoville Kid. Again, as we mentioned, big weekend in college hoops. Purdue takes on Michigan as they try to solidify where they are at as the, right now it appears, top overall seed in the NCAA tournament ended today. IU against Penn State, for Mike Woodson's sake, win that game. They're not really playing for anything anymore other than pride. So hopefully they get that done. Again, Butler and Seton Hall this weekend as well, as Butler is still vying for a spot in the tournament, and that's effectively a play-in game for them. John will cover all that and so much more in a look ahead to the Combine. That's right, JMV is back. He's live from Gigi's Bar and Grill over on 71st Street. Jake will be back in on Monday. Until we talk to you, keep it right here. Ride with JMV is next on The Fan.
The Pacers are breaking all the rules.